Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first night I heard it, a soft, rhythmic scraping from above. Not loud enough to warrant complaint, but persistent enough to pierce the veil between consciousness and sleep. 3 a.m. My phone screen glared accusingly as I lay rigid under the covers, listening to what sounded like furniture being slowly dragged across hardwood floors in apartment 803. Just a neighbor with insomnia, I reasoned, nothing more. I had moved into the Edificio Paraíso only 4 days prior, drawn by its faded grandeur and affordable rent in downtown Curitiba. The property listing had emphasized historic charm, a generous euphemism for the building's decaying Art Deco facade, outdated plumbing, and persistent smell of mildew that permeated the common areas. But at 34, recently divorced and desperate for a fresh start away from São Paulo, I couldn't afford to be particular. The 7th floor apartment was clean enough, spacious by city standards, and required only a 6-month lease commitment. Perfect for a man unsure of his next move. The building itself seemed to exist in a perpetual state of twilight. Narrow corridors with flickering fluorescence, wallpaper peeling at the seams like dead skin, an elevator that wheezed and groaned its ascent, moving with the reluctance of an arthritic old man. The few neighbors I'd encountered were mostly elderly, their faces etched with the same weathered indifference as the building itself. They offered curt nods in passing, but nothing more. I preferred it that way. The noises continued the following night. Not just furniture this time, but footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing the exact length of my bedroom ceiling, back and forth, back and forth. At 2:17 a.m. they stopped abruptly, replaced by the unmistakable sound of running water. I imagined someone standing under a shower, letting it pour over them in the dead of night. For 97 minutes, according to my increasingly agitated documentation, the water ran without interruption. By the third night, exhaustion had settled into my bones like concrete. Each noise from above seemed amplified tenfold. The dragging had evolved into a violent shoving, the footsteps no longer methodical but frantic, as if someone were searching for something with increasing desperation. When the water started running, I could have sworn I heard humming beneath the steady stream, a low, tuneless drone that seemed to vibrate through the pipes and into my walls. I resolved to speak with my upstairs neighbor the next morning. Reasonable people could come to reasonable accommodations. Perhaps they worked nights and were unaware of the disturbance. I rehearsed a polite but firm speech as I climbed the stairs to the 8th floor, bypassing the temperamental elevator. The hallway was identical to my own. Same faded runner carpet, same numbered doors with peeling brass digits. I stood before 803 and knocked firmly. No response. I knocked again, longer this time, my knuckles whitening against the dark wood. The silence that answered held a peculiar quality. Not the silence of an empty apartment, but the deliberate quiet of someone holding their breath on the other side. My skin prickled with the distinct sensation of being watched. I turned to find Marcos, the building superintendent, observing me from the stairwell, a ring of keys dangling from his gnarled hand. When I explained about the noise, his weathered face creased with confusion. He informed me, not without a certain reluctance, that apartment 803 had been vacant for over 5 years. The owner had moved abroad, leaving the property in limbo. No one had stayed there for more than 3 nights. Not the occasional relative checking on the place. Not the real estate agents attempting to sell it. No one. I laughed, a hollow sound even to my own ears. Clearly there was some mistake. I described the noises in detail, the furniture moving, the pacing, the incessant shower. With each description, Marcos's expression grew darker. He suggested, with careful neutrality, that the building settled at night, that pipes contracted, that perhaps I was overtired from my recent move. I insisted on seeing the apartment. After some persuasion, he reluctantly unlocked the door. The musty smell hit me first, the unmistakable scent of long abandonment. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of light piercing through the closed blinds. Sheets draped the sparse furniture like shrouds. The floor, and this detail lodged itself in my throat like a stone, was carpeted, wall to wall. Impossible to drag anything across it with the scraping sound I'd heard night after night. In the bathroom, the shower head was bone dry, crusted with mineral deposits from years of disuse. Marcos, visibly uncomfortable, suggested that perhaps I was hearing noises from another apartment. Sound traveled strangely in old buildings, he explained. It could be coming from below, from the sides, echoing through the ventilation system. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew it came from above. That night I waited. Tension coiled inside me like a spring as midnight came and went in silence. 1 a.m. Nothing. By 2, I had almost convinced myself that Marcos was right. Perhaps it had been my imagination, stress manifesting in auditory hallucinations. I was drifting toward sleep when it started, not from above this time, from inside my own apartment. The scraping sound emerged from my living room. Slow, deliberate, impossibly close. My lungs seized. Sweat erupted across my skin in an instant, cold and slick. I lay paralyzed, ears straining against the darkness, heart threatening to burst from my chest. It was moving toward my bedroom. Fight or flight instinct screamed through my nervous system, but my limbs refused to obey. I could only listen as something heavy dragged itself across my floor, inch by excruciating inch. The sound stopped just outside my bedroom door. The handle turned, slowly, almost tentatively. Metal against metal, a whispered mechanical protest. My door remained shut. I had locked it, a habit from childhood that had never abandoned me. The handle continued to turn, back and forth with increasing urgency. Then came the knocking. Not the conventional rap of knuckles, but something softer, wetter, like damp flesh slapping against wood. I must have lost consciousness. When awareness returned, sunlight streamed through my curtains. My sheets were soaked through with sweat, and my throat felt raw as if I'd been screaming. I examined my apartment with trembling hands and found nothing out of place. No wet footprints on the hardwood. No furniture moved from its position. I convinced myself it had been a particularly vivid nightmare, born from suggestion and sleep deprivation. I spent that day researching the building's history online. The Edificio Paraíso had been constructed in 1937, surviving earthquakes, political upheavals, and decades of neglect. Local forums mentioned its character and affordable rent, but nothing sinister. I expanded my search, looking for any incidents reported at the address. Nothing significant emerged beyond routine complaints about maintenance and the occasional noise disturbance. In a moment of desperate intuition, I searched for information specifically about apartment 803. A single result appeared, a small news item from 5 years prior. The previous occupant, an elderly woman, had been found in her bathtub after neighbors reported water leaking into the apartments below. The article was vague about the circumstances, mentioning only that she had passed away at home and that authorities ruled out foul play. That night, I invited a colleague from my new job to have dinner at my apartment. Paulo's presence seemed to neutralize the oppressive atmosphere that had accumulated over the previous days. We talked, drank beer, watched football, normal activities that anchored me to reality. When he left around 11, I felt almost foolish about my fears. I fell asleep on the couch, television still murmuring in the background. The sound that woke me was subtle. Water droplets hitting the floor in a steady rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. I opened my eyes to find my ceiling weeping. Water seeped through the plaster, collecting in a darkening stain directly above me. As I watched, transfixed with horror, the droplets accelerated from occasional to constant. A thin stream began to pour down, splashing onto my chest. It was warm. The ceiling creaked, sagged. Something was pressing down from above, a weight that the structure was never designed to bear. The plaster bulged downward, cracks spreading like spiderwebs. I scrambled backwards, my limbs finally responding to the panic surging through my system. The water running down was no longer clear but darkened, carrying particles of plaster and what looked horribly like hair, long black strands that clung to the growing puddle on my floor. The television flickered, static replacing the late-night program. In its bluish glow, I could see the ceiling bulging lower, something pressing against the weakening barrier. I fled to my bedroom, slammed the door, wedged a chair under the handle. Through the wood, I could hear the living room ceiling finally give way with a sickening crack. The splash that followed suggested something far heavier than water had fallen through. Something substantial, something with weight. Then came the footsteps. Slow, squelching, waterlogged steps crossing my living room floor. Water seeped under my bedroom door, soaking into the carpet. Not clear water, but darkened, viscous. The smell hit me then. Not the expected mustiness of water damage, but something far worse. The unmistakable copper tang of blood mixed with the putrid sweetness of advanced decay. The knocking began again, that same wet, fleshy sound against my door. Not persistent this time, but patient, unhurried, as if whatever waited on the other side had all the time in the world. The door handle turned, stopped by the lock. The chair legs scraped against the floor as something pressed against the barrier. I backed against the far wall, phone clutched in my hand. I had dialed emergency services, but the call wouldn't connect. No signal, despite the full bars displayed on screen. The handle continued to turn, back and forth, the mechanism clicking softly. The chair inched forward with each push from the other side. A voice emerged from beyond the door, not spoken aloud, but somehow inside my head. It whispered my name with terrible intimacy, as if it had known me all my life. It told me it had been waiting, that I had finally arrived, that we had unfinished business from before. Before what? I couldn't say. I had never set foot in Curitiba before my job transfer. I had never known anyone who lived in this building. Yet the voice spoke with the certainty of shared history, of a reckoning long delayed. Morning found me huddled in the corner of my bedroom, eyes fixed on the door that had somehow remained closed throughout the night. My living room showed no sign of the ceiling collapse I was certain had occurred. No water damage, no debris, the ceiling intact, unblemished. I packed a bag with shaking hands and checked into a hotel. When I called the building management to terminate my lease, they seemed unsurprised. The woman on the phone didn't even ask for a reason. She simply confirmed my unit number and processed my request with mechanical efficiency. I returned only once, 2 weeks later, to collect the remainder of my belongings. Marcos helped me, his face carefully neutral as we packed my things. As we finished, he hesitated at the door. "You heard them too, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The footsteps? The water running?" I nodded, throat too dry for words. "They say she was in that bathtub for 3 days before anyone found her," he continued, eyes fixed on the floor. "The water running the whole time. They say..." He stopped himself, made a furtive sign of the cross. "They say she's still looking for someone who was supposed to meet her that night but never came." I never discovered who had lived in apartment 703 before me. The management company claimed their records had been lost in a system update. Online searches revealed nothing. But sometimes in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, I hear footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate, waterlogged. And I feel, with terrible certainty, that our unfinished business remains exactly that, unfinished. I've moved 4 times since then. Different cities, different states. It doesn't matter. The footsteps always find me eventually. And the water. Always the water. Even now as I write this, I can hear it. The soft, persistent dripping from my bathroom. The shower I know I turned off hours ago. It's getting louder. Story 2. In the first whisper came like a breath against the back of my neck. So faint I couldn't be sure it wasn't just the wind finding its way through some microscopic crack in the cabin's weathered frame. But there was something about it, something in the way it seemed to curl around my ear, that made my skin tighten, and the hair on my arms stand at attention. I froze, coffee mug suspended halfway to my lips, and listened. Nothing. Just the gentle crackle of the fireplace and the distant percussion of rain against the roof. I dismissed it, chalking it up to the isolation playing tricks on my mind. 3 days alone in a remote cabin in Serra da Mantiqueira will do that to you. I didn't know then that the silence was merely the prelude to the horror that would unfold. I had come to the mountains seeking solitude. My life in Sao Paulo had become a suffocating tangle of deadlines, traffic, and the constant barrage of human interaction. When my colleague mentioned his family's cabin, nestled high in the misty peaks of Mantiqueira, I jumped at the opportunity. 3 days, completely off-grid. No cell service, no internet. Just me, a stack of books, and the ancient dense forest surrounding the property. The perfect reset. The cabin itself was rustic but comfortable, a sturdy A-frame structure with a stone fireplace, worn leather furniture, and windows that framed the sprawling valley below. I arrived Friday afternoon as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. After unpacking my provisions and starting a fire, I settled into what I hoped would be a weekend of peaceful contemplation. That first night passed uneventfully. I read by the fire's glow, sipping whiskey and listening to the symphony of the forest, the hollow calls of nightbirds, the rhythmic chirping of insects, the occasional rustle of underbrush as some nocturnal creature went about its business. I slept deeply, lulled by mountain air and absolute darkness. It was during my second day that I first sensed something was off. I spent the morning hiking a nearby trail, then returned to the cabin as afternoon clouds gathered, promising rain. I prepared lunch, speaking aloud to myself as I often did when alone. Nothing profound, just mundane commentary about the sandwich I was making, an observation about the impending storm, a reminder to check the firewood supply. Talking to myself was a habit that had intensified during my self-imposed exile from social media. I found comfort in the sound of a human voice, even if it was just my own. The rain began around 3, a gentle patter that quickly intensified into a full-on mountain deluge. I built up the fire and settled onto the couch with a novel. That's when I heard it for the first time, a faint murmur coming from somewhere above me. I glanced up at the wooden ceiling. The cabin's A-frame construction meant there was a small attic space, accessible only by a pull-down ladder in the back hallway. My colleague had mentioned using it for storage, but assured me there was nothing up there I'd need during my stay. I returned to my book, dismissing the sound as water finding its way along the roof beams. But then it came again, more distinct. Not the random patter of raindrops or the arbitrary howl of wind, but something with rhythm, with cadence. Something almost like words. My pulse quickened slightly as I set down my book. I stood, tilting my head to better locate the source. Definitely from above, definitely not just the rain. I moved to the center of the room, directly beneath where the sound seemed strongest. That's when I heard it clearly. Check the firewood supply. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The words weren't just similar to what I'd said earlier. They were identical, delivered in a whispered approximation of my own voice. I stood paralyzed, my breathing suddenly shallow and rapid. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill that had seized my body. I forced myself to be rational. Perhaps it was an echo, some bizarre acoustic phenomenon caused by the cabin's construction. Or maybe I was more exhausted than I realized, my mind manufacturing connections where none existed. I spoke aloud, testing my theory. It's just the wind. Then I waited, counting my heartbeats as they hammered against my ribcage. 1, 2, 3, 20, 30. A minute passed in silence and my breathing began to return to normal. I laughed nervously at my own superstition. Of course it was just the wind, or branches scraping against the roof, or "It's just the wind," came the whisper from above, 3 hours later as I was washing dinner dishes. My hands clutched the edge of the sink, knuckles whitening. The plate I'd been washing clattered against the metal basin. There was no mistaking it this time. The same intonation, the same cadence. My own words returned to me in a hushed, sibilant approximation of my voice. I dried my hands on a dish towel, leaving damp fingerprints on the fabric. My mouth had gone dry, and I could feel my pulse at my temples, in my wrists, in my throat. Something was in the attic. Something was listening, and now it was speaking back. Rational explanations evaporated as quickly as I could conjure them. I hadn't mentioned the attic to anyone. I hadn't spoken aloud about checking it. There was no way for anyone to know I was disturbed by sounds from above, yet here were my own casual phrases being whispered back at me hours after I'd spoken them. I found myself moving toward the hallway where the attic access was located. My feet seemed to operate independently of my terror-frozen mind. A trapdoor was set into the ceiling, with a small cord dangling from it. I reached up, my hand trembling visibly, and pulled. The ladder descended smoothly, without the creak of disuse I expected. Had someone recently been up there? I stood at the base, staring up into the darkness. I hadn't brought a flashlight, and the cabin's electricity was limited to a few essential outlets. The darkness of the attic opening seemed to have weight, substance. It felt as if I were looking not into a storage space, but into a mouth. I retreated to the main room, focusing on controlling my breathing. I needed light before investigating further. I found a battery-powered lantern in a kitchen drawer and returned to the hallway. The attic opening still gaped, black and expectant. I placed a foot on the first rung. "Hello?" I called up, immediately regretting giving warning of my approach. Silence answered me. I climbed another rung. The wooden ladder creaked under my weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. Another step. Another. I raised the lantern, trying to pierce the darkness above. The attic was empty, or at least empty of anything unusual. A few sealed cardboard boxes, an old steamer trunk, exposed rafters and insulation. I hoisted myself up, sweeping the lantern across the space. Nothing to explain the whispers. No hidden speakers. No sign of habitation. No openings where someone might have entered from outside. I was simultaneously relieved and more disturbed. If nothing was here, then what had I heard? I lowered myself back down the ladder and returned to the main room, leaving the attic access open. If something was up there, I wanted to hear it coming. The remainder of the evening passed in hyper-vigilant silence. I avoided speaking aloud, even as the isolation pressed down on me like a physical weight. I kept the lantern close, its circle of light a fragile barrier against the shadows that seemed to grow deeper in the corners of the cabin. At some point, exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep on the couch, unwilling to retreat to the bedroom where I'd be farther from the exit. I awoke to pre-dawn grayness and the distinct feeling of being watched. My skin prickled with the sensation of eyes on me, not from the attic, but from every direction at once. I sat up slowly, muscles stiff from the awkward sleeping position. The fire had died to embers, and the cabin was cold. But that wasn't what sent shivers cascading down my spine. Written in the condensation on the window beside the couch were words. My words. From conversations I'd had with myself over the past 2 days. Random phrases. Perfect reset. Impending storm. Comfort in the sound of a human voice. The handwriting was not my own. The letters were formed with meticulous precision, each one identical to the next, as if printed rather than written. I lunged from the couch, nearly overturning the coffee table in my haste. My heart hammered so violently I could feel it in my fingertips, in my eardrums. I grabbed my phone from the table. No service, as expected, but I could at least use the flashlight. I moved to the window, forcing myself to examine the writing more closely. The condensation was on the inside of the glass. Whatever had written these words had been in the room with me while I slept. A sound escaped me, something between a gasp and a moan. I spun around, sweeping the phone's light across the room. Nothing seemed disturbed. Nothing seemed different. Except for the attic ladder, which now was retracted. The trapdoor closed as if it had never been opened. I stumbled to the front door, twisted the deadbolt with shaking hands and flung it open. The mountain air hit me like a slap, cold and sharp with the scent of pine and wet earth. Dawn was just beginning to break, the forest transforming from black silhouettes to distinct shapes. I stood in the doorway, one foot on the threshold, torn between fleeing into the woods and the fear of what might await me out there. My rational mind made a last desperate attempt to assert itself. Perhaps I was experiencing some kind of breakdown, stress-induced hallucinations. Maybe there was a gas leak in the cabin, carbon monoxide slowly poisoning my brain. Any of these explanations seemed preferable to accepting what my senses were telling me, that something was in this cabin with me, something that collected my words and returned them in whispers and writing. I forced myself to close the door. If this was a psychological episode, running half-dressed into the mountains would only put me in physical danger. Better to gather my belongings calmly and drive back to civilization, seek help if necessary. I moved to the bedroom to pack, my eyes constantly darting to the ceiling, the windows, the corners of the room. As I stuffed clothes into my backpack, a new sound stopped me cold. Not whispers this time, but a slow, deliberate scratching. It came from the ceiling directly above me. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. Like something being dragged across the wooden boards, or like something writing. I abandoned my packing and moved back to the main room, neck craned upward, following the sound as it traveled across the ceiling. It stopped directly above the center of the room. Then came a sound I can only describe as a sigh, a long exhalation that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. What followed was worse than any whisper, any writing on glass. In the stillness of the cabin, I heard my own voice, not whispered, but played back with perfect clarity, as if from a recording. Every word I had spoken aloud since arriving at the cabin, in chronological order, like an audio diary I hadn't known was being kept. My mundane observations, my one-sided conversations, the sound of my breathing as I slept. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voice, my voice, continued, seeping through my fingers as if they were nothing. The playback reached the previous night, to the moment I stood beneath the attic opening. "Hello," my voice called from above. And then, something new. Not my voice anymore, but something using my vocal patterns, my inflections, to form words I had never spoken. "I've been collecting you, word by word, breath by breath. Tomorrow, I will be you." I didn't pack. I didn't even change out of my sleep clothes. I grabbed my car keys and phone and fled the cabin, the door slamming behind me with a finality that echoed through the trees. As I fumbled with the car lock, I glanced back at the cabin. In the growing light of dawn, I could see something in the small attic window, a silhouette, person-shaped but somehow wrong, like a reflection in troubled water. I drove down the mountain road at dangerous speeds, the car fishtailing on the wet gravel. Only when I reached the main highway, when civilization appeared in the form of a gas station with a cluster of morning customers, did I allow myself to pull over. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice trying to remove them from the ignition. I never returned to the cabin, though I did eventually retrieve my belongings. My colleague was confused but accommodating when I claimed a family emergency had forced me to leave abruptly. He sent someone to clean and secure the property, who reported nothing unusual, except a few phrases written on the bathroom mirror. Words my colleague recognized as his own, spoken during his last stay at the cabin months ago. Sometimes, late at night in my city apartment, surrounded by the comforting noise of traffic and neighbors, I wake to what sounds like a whisper coming from the vents. Words I spoke earlier in the day return to me in the dark. And sometimes, though I live alone, I find phrases written in the steam on my bathroom mirror after a shower. Words in my exact handwriting, but which I have no memory of writing. I've stopped speaking aloud to myself. I've covered all the mirrors in my apartment. But deep down, I know these precautions are futile. Whatever was in that cabin didn't need the attic to collect me. It's been collecting all of us, word by word, breath by breath, waiting for its moment to become us completely. And the worst part? I think it's been doing this long before any of us noticed. I think it's already become many of us. I think it's already here. Story 3. The first time I noticed something wrong with the mirror was 3 days after moving in. Not immediately. That would have been a mercy. Instead, the strangeness crept in gradually, allowing me to question my own perception before I could be certain of what I was seeing. By then, it was already too late. The Victorian townhouse on Blackwood Lane was exactly what I needed after my divorce. Affordable, secluded, and with enough restoration work required to keep my mind occupied. The real estate agent had been suspiciously eager to close the deal, rushing through paperwork and glossing over the property's history with practiced deflections. I didn't press the issue. At 38, with half my possessions gone and a freshly signed settlement agreement, I was more concerned with moving forward than dwelling on whatever ghosts might inhabit my new address. The previous owner had left in a hurry, according to the neighbors. A reclusive older man who disappeared one night without explanation, leaving behind most of his possessions. The agent assured me these would be cleared before I moved in, but when I arrived with my meager collection of boxes, I discovered several rooms still cluttered with forgotten belongings. The attic, particularly, remained untouched. I spent the first 2 days cleaning the main living spaces, scrubbing away decades of neglect, and arranging my few remaining possessions in a futile attempt to make the echoing rooms feel inhabited. On the third day, I tackled the attic. The narrow staircase leading up creaked under my weight, each step releasing small clouds of dust that danced in the thin beams of light streaming through a small round window. The air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of old paper and wood rot. As I reached the top, I felt a peculiar resistance, as if the air itself had thickened, pushing back against my intrusion. The attic stretched the length of the house, low-ceilinged and crammed with forgotten treasures and worthless junk alike. Cardboard boxes sagged under the weight of old books. Trunks overflowed with yellowed clothing, and against the far wall, partially covered by a faded sheet, stood an ornate floor mirror. I approached it slowly, stepping carefully around the obstacles scattered across the wooden floor. The sheet came away easily, releasing another cloud of dust that made me cough and turn away momentarily. When I looked back, I found myself staring at my reflection in an oval mirror framed in dark wood carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift subtly in the dim light. The glass itself was flawless, unusual for an antique piece. No bubbles, no discoloration, just a perfect silvery surface that reflected the attic with unsettling clarity. I stood before it, studying my own face, thinner now, with new lines around my eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before the divorce. I raised my hand to touch the stubble on my jaw. That's when I noticed it. A delay. Barely perceptible, perhaps a quarter of a second, but my reflection's hand moved after mine, like an actor missing his cue. I frowned. My reflection frowned too, but again, just slightly too late. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or fatigue from the move. I covered the mirror again, and continued sorting through the attic's contents. But throughout the day, my thoughts kept returning to that slight delay, that tiny desynchronization between my movements and their reflection. That night, I dreamed of the mirror. In my dream, I stood before it again, but my reflection wore an expression I couldn't feel on my own face. A slight smile, knowing and secretive. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The next morning, I returned to the attic. I don't know why. Curiosity, perhaps, or a stubborn unwillingness to be unsettled by an inanimate object. I uncovered the mirror again and stood before it. This time the delay was more pronounced. When I raised my hand, my reflection waited a full second before mimicking the gesture. When I stepped back in surprise, my reflection remained still for a moment before following. I convinced myself it was some strange optical illusion, perhaps related to the mirror's age or construction. I decided to move it downstairs to my bedroom, partly to examine it in better light, partly as a challenge to my growing unease. It was heavier than it looked, and awkward to maneuver down the narrow attic stairs, but I managed to install it in the corner of my bedroom. Under the bright light of my bedside lamp, the mirror looked less mystical, more simply antique. I performed a series of movements in front of it, raising and lowering my arms, turning my head, stepping side to side. Sometimes my reflection followed perfectly in sync. Other times, the delay returned, growing longer and more noticeable. I began to keep a journal documenting the mirror's behavior. Part of me recognized the absurdity of this, treating an object as if it had agency. But I needed to convince myself I wasn't imagining things. Each day, the discrepancies grew more pronounced. By the end of the first week, my reflection was consistently lagging behind my movements by several seconds. By the middle of the second week, it had begun to deviate entirely. I would raise my right hand, my reflection would raise its left. I would step forward, it would remain still. Most disturbing of all was when I stood motionless before the mirror, my face carefully blank, and watched my reflection slowly curl its lips into a smile I wasn't making. Sleep became increasingly difficult. I would wake throughout the night with the certainty that someone was watching me. Several times I jerked awake to see my reflection sitting up in the mirrored bed while I was lying down, its eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that sent ice through my veins. I began to cover the mirror with a sheet before sleeping, but each morning I would find the sheet on the floor, the mirror uncovered, though I was certain I hadn't touched it. My colleagues at the architectural firm noticed the change in me. During a meeting about a new project, my supervisor asked if everything was all right. I looked exhausted, he said. My hands shook as I assured him I was fine, just adjusting to the new house. He suggested taking some time off. I declined. The thought of spending more time alone with the mirror filled me with a dread I couldn't articulate. I considered getting rid of it, but something always stopped me. An odd compulsion, a need to understand what was happening, kept me from simply carrying it to the curb. Instead, I began researching the history of the house and its previous owner. The local historical society provided little information beyond the house's construction date and a list of previous owners. The man who had lived there before me, Malcolm Harrow, had purchased the house 15 years ago and had indeed disappeared without explanation just 3 months earlier. Before him, the house had stood empty for nearly a decade following the sudden departure of a young couple. Their names weren't recorded, but the volunteer noted that there had been an incident, though she claimed not to know the details. At the town library, I searched through newspaper archives. There was no mention of Malcolm Harrow's disappearance, strange for a small town where even minor events typically made the local paper. However, I did find a small article from 25 years earlier, describing how the young couple who had lived in my house had been admitted to a psychiatric facility after what was vaguely described as shared delusions of persecution. No further details were provided. That night I returned home later than usual, having spent hours at the library. The house was dark and unusually cold despite the mild spring evening. As I moved through each room turning on lights, I felt a heaviness in the air, a presence that seemed to follow me from room to room. When I reached my bedroom, I stood outside the door for several minutes, unable to bring myself to enter. Finally, gathering my courage, I pushed the door open. The mirror stood in its corner, reflecting the darkened room. But as I watched, something moved in its surface, a shadow that had no counterpart in the actual room. My reflection was nowhere to be seen, though I stood directly in the mirror's line of sight. I backed away, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The shadow in the mirror moved again, approaching the glass from the other side. It was roughly human-shaped, but somehow wrong. The proportions slightly off, the movements too fluid. As it drew closer to the surface of the mirror, features began to form. A face that resembled mine but wasn't quite right, like a sculpture made by someone who had only heard my appearance described. I retreated to the guest bedroom that night, locking the door behind me. But even there, I could feel the mirror's presence, a constant pressure at the edge of my awareness. When I did manage to sleep, my dreams were filled with endless corridors of mirrors in which my reflection chased me, always one step behind until suddenly it wasn't behind me at all, but ahead, waiting. The next morning I called in sick to work. I needed to deal with the mirror. This time I was determined to remove it from the house. I entered my bedroom cautiously. The mirror looked normal again, reflecting the room accurately. When I moved, my reflection moved with me, perfectly synchronized. A wave of relief washed over me, followed immediately by doubt. Had I imagined everything? Was I having some kind of breakdown? I approached the mirror carefully, studying my reflection. It matched my movements exactly. I raised my hand. It raised its hand. I frowned. It frowned. Then, experimentally, I smiled. My reflection remained solemn for a long moment before its lips slowly curved upward in a smile that stretched too wide, revealing too many teeth. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. My reflection didn't move. It stood there, still smiling that impossible smile, while I pressed myself against the opposite wall. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its hand and pressed its palm against the glass from the other side. The surface of the mirror rippled like disturbed water. I watched in horror as my reflection's hand began to push through, the glass yielding like a membrane. Fingers emerged into my bedroom, then a wrist, an arm, pale and wrong somehow, the skin too smooth, too perfect, like a wax reproduction. I ran. Out of the bedroom, down the stairs, out the front door onto the street. I stood on the sidewalk, gasping for breath, staring up at my bedroom window. The curtains were still. No sign of movement within. A passing neighbor called out, asking if I was okay. I managed to nod, though I knew I looked anything but okay. Wild-eyed, pale, still in yesterday's rumpled clothes. I couldn't stay out there forever. Eventually, I forced myself to return inside, moving cautiously through the house, listening for any sound that didn't belong. When I reached my bedroom door, I paused, then slowly pushed it open. The mirror was exactly as it had always been. My reflection moved when I moved, perfectly synchronized once again. I approached it warily, studying every detail. Nothing seemed amiss until I noticed something on the glass. A faint handprint, as if someone had pressed their palm against the other side, leaving a slight smudge. I packed a bag that afternoon and checked into a motel on the edge of town. I told myself I needed distance, perspective. I needed to decide if I was really experiencing something supernatural, or if stress and isolation were causing me to hallucinate. 3 days in a generic motel room with no mirror except the small one above the bathroom sink helped clear my head. I began to rationalize what I'd experienced. Stress from the divorce, anxiety about starting over, perhaps even some undiagnosed condition exacerbated by the poor air quality in the old house. When I returned home, I went directly to my bedroom. The mirror stood in its corner, innocuous in the afternoon light. I stood before it, watching my reflection mimic my movements perfectly. Relief washed over me, followed by embarrassment at how I'd overreacted. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. I woke once, briefly, thinking I'd heard movement, but saw nothing unusual and quickly fell back asleep. In the morning, I noticed something odd as I was getting dressed. A small bruise on my forearm that I couldn't remember getting. As I examined it in the bathroom mirror, I realized it was in the exact shape of fingertips, as if someone had grabbed me tightly. I looked up from my arm to my face in the mirror and froze. Behind me, visible in the mirror but not present in the actual bathroom, stood my reflection, watching me with my own eyes. As I stared in horror, unable to move or even breathe, it smiled and slowly raised a finger to its lips. I still live in the house on Blackwood Lane. I've considered moving, of course, but something always stops me. The mirror remains in my bedroom, though I've draped it with a heavy black cloth. Sometimes I find the cloth on the floor when I wake up. Sometimes I catch glimpses of my reflection when there are no mirrors present. In windows, in the darkened screen of my television, in puddles after rain. I've stopped looking for my reflection in mirrors altogether, because I know now that whatever looks back at me isn't me anymore. And I live with the constant gnawing fear that one day I'll look into a mirror and see nothing at all, because I'll be on the other side of the glass, watching someone else live my life while I press my palms helplessly against the cold, unyielding surface, forever trapped in that inverted world. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear tapping on the glass. I never answer it. I never will. But sometimes, I wonder if it's too late already, if the exchange has already happened, and I'm the reflection now, moving through a reversed world that feels almost, but not quite, like home. Story 4. The first time I saw the lights, I convinced myself they were reflections. Old railway yards play tricks on the eyes, especially during the graveyard shift when shadows stretch like hungry things across rusted tracks and abandoned cars. But reflections don't move with purpose. They don't pause at junctions, hover over specific sections of track, or vanish when approached. Most importantly, reflections don't watch you back. I've been the night watchman at Holloway Rail Yard for 4 months now. The job wasn't my first choice. Hell, it wasn't even my 10th. But in this economy, you take what you can get. 3 nights a week, I patrol the sprawling industrial graveyard of decommissioned train cars and crumbling warehouses on the outskirts of town. The railway company keeps minimal security to deter vandals and metal thieves, though I suspect it's more about insurance requirements than actual concern for the property. The yard is immense, over 30 acres of twisted rails and forgotten machinery slowly being reclaimed by nature. My supervisor, Jenkins, gave me a perfunctory tour on my first day, pointing out the key buildings I needed to check during my rounds. "Don't bother with the south section," he'd said, nodding toward a collection of dilapidated structures half hidden by overgrown vegetation. "Nothing down there but Track 7 and the old warehouse. Company's demolishing it all next year anyway." I asked about Track 7, wondering why it warranted specific mention. Jenkins shrugged, avoiding my eyes. "Just an old maintenance track. Equipment's outdated, unsafe. Keep to your assigned route and you'll be fine." But his forced casualness and quick change of subject left me with a nagging curiosity about that section of the yard. I followed orders, though. For the first month, at least. The isolation got to me quickly. 12 hours alone in the dark, armed with nothing but a flashlight, radio, and thermos of coffee. The constant background symphony of creaking metal, rustling wildlife, and distant traffic became my only company. I started taking longer routes during my rounds just to fill the endless hours, exploring abandoned office buildings and maintenance sheds not on my checklist. It was during the 5th week when I first ventured toward the south section. My flashlight beam cut through the November fog as I picked my way through knee-high weeds and debris. The old warehouse loomed ahead, a massive rectangular shadow against the night sky. Its windows were black holes, most of the glass long gone. The surrounding ground was a maze of tracks, switches, and signals, a transit network to nowhere. That's when I saw it, a faint, yellowish glow moving slowly between 2 rail cars about 100 yards ahead. My first thought was trespassers, maybe teenagers looking for trouble or homeless people seeking shelter. I radioed in my position out of protocol but didn't mention the light. Instead, I approached cautiously, keeping my flashlight trained on the spot. The light moved with deliberate slowness, swaying slightly like an old-fashioned lantern carried at hip height. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. The light cast no illumination on the surrounding area. It didn't brighten the ground or reflect off the metal surfaces nearby. It was just there, a self-contained orb of amber light drifting between the tracks. And then it vanished, not gradually fading or moving behind something. It simply winked out of existence the moment I got within 30 feet. I spent 20 minutes searching the area with my flashlight, expecting to find someone hiding, but there was nothing. No footprints in the soft ground, no disturbance in the thick layer of dust inside the nearest rail cars, no signs of entry or exit. The ambient temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees, and the back of my neck prickled with goose flesh. I told myself it was exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Working nights messes with your perception. Every security guard knows that. I marked it down to fatigue and an overactive imagination, but I couldn't shake the uneasiness that followed me through the remainder of my shift. 2 nights later, I saw the lights again. 3 of them this time, moving in perfect synchronization along Track 7. They maintained a consistent distance from each other, about 10 feet apart, and moved at the same steady pace. I stood frozen, watching them drift toward the warehouse, my heart hammering against my ribs. This time I had my phone ready. I activated the camera and zoomed in. The screen showed nothing but darkness where I clearly saw the lights with my naked eyes. I toggled to video mode and recorded for nearly a minute, narrating what I was seeing, but the playback revealed only blackness and my increasingly agitated voice describing things that weren't captured. My mouth went dry, and my hands trembled as I pocketed the phone and continued watching the lights until they disappeared into the warehouse. Over the next few weeks, the sightings became more frequent, sometimes just a single light, other times 7 or 8 moving in formation. They always kept to the tracks, particularly track 7, and always vanished when I attempted to document them. I tried different cameras, different angles, even night vision equipment I borrowed from a friend, but the results were consistently the same. The lights remained visible only to my direct perception. I made discreet inquiries. I asked Jenkins about previous incidents at the yard, keeping my tone casual. His response was a study in avoidance, vague answers, sudden topics changes, and insistence that the south section was restricted purely for structural concerns. When I pressed about track 7 specifically, something flickered behind his eyes. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice despite us being alone in the office. "Some places collect stories. This yard's been operating since 1887. You think nothing ever happened here?" He wouldn't elaborate further, but his message was clear. Leave it alone. I couldn't. The mystery consumed my thoughts during shifts and followed me home afterward. I began researching the yard's history, combing through local newspaper archives and railroad company records. What I found were fragmented stories, references to incidents that seemed deliberately obscured in the official documentation. In 1923, 3 railway workers disappeared during the overnight shift. Their lanterns were found perfectly placed along track 7, still lit but abandoned. The official report cited desertion, claiming all 3 men had personal troubles and likely fled town together. But a small article in the local paper quoted family members insisting the men were stable, reliable workers with no reason to leave. In 1949, a night watchman, someone who had held my exact position, suffered a complete psychological breakdown. He was found at dawn, curled in a fetal position beside track 7, muttering about lights that watched and those who walked between the rails. He never recovered enough to explain what happened. There were other incidents, scattered across decades. Maintenance crews refusing to work the south section. Equipment inexplicably failing near track 7. Workers reporting unexplained lights or claiming to hear phantom train whistles where no trains had run for years. The pattern was unmistakable, but what did it mean? I became obsessed with documenting my experiences, keeping a detailed journal of each sighting, time, location, movement patterns, my physical and emotional responses. I sketched maps of the yard, marking where the lights appeared most frequently. Track 7 was the epicenter, but the activity was spreading outward, week by week, like ripples in a pond. And then the dream started. I would find myself standing beside track 7 in the darkest part of night. The air would be unnaturally still, sounds muffled as if underwater. The lights would approach, not amber this time, but a sickly blue-white, arranging themselves in a circle around me. From each light, a shadow would extend along the ground, stretching toward me. I always woke just as the shadows reached my feet, my sheets soaked with sweat, my throat raw as if I'd been screaming. I began to dread my shifts. My supervisor noticed the change in my demeanor, the dark circles under my eyes, my jumpiness. He suggested I take some time off. I refused. Whatever was happening at the yard, I needed to understand it. Last week, I made a discovery that changed everything. During a thorough exploration of the warehouse near track 7, I found a trapdoor hidden beneath decades of dust and debris. It took all my strength to lift it, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was stale and carried an odd metallic scent, like copper pennies left too long in the sun. My flashlight beam seemed to dim as I descended the stairs, the concrete walls pressing closer with each step. At the bottom was a single room, perhaps 15 feet square, its walls covered with faded photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes connected by strands of red yarn. An investigation board created by someone long before me. At the center of this web of information was a yellowed photograph dated October 1887, showing a group of railway workers posed beside a newly laid section of track. Their faces were solemn, 19th century formality etched into their stiff postures. But what made my blood run cold was the caption beneath, clearly identifying the location as Track 7 upon completion. Because in the background of the photograph, barely visible but unmistakably present, were 7 orbs of light hovering above the rails. The truth slammed into me with physical force. The lights predated any incident. They weren't the result of tragic events at the yard. They had been there from the beginning. Among the papers was a journal, its leather binding cracked with age. The entries, written in a cramped, desperate hand, documented an experience unnervingly similar to my own. The author, who signed only with the initial M, described the lights, their behavior, the inability to capture them with the photographic equipment of the time. The entries grew increasingly frantic, describing dreams identical to mine and a growing certainty that the lights were attempting communication. The final entry, dated November 1888, contained a single sentence. They are not lights. They are windows, and something is looking through. My hands shook so badly, I could barely climb back up the stairs. I spent the remainder of that shift in the security office, refusing to make my rounds, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, I fled the yard without completing my paperwork, driving home well above the speed limit. I called in sick for my next 2 shifts. Jenkins sounded relieved rather than annoyed, telling me to take all the time I needed, but isolation proved worse than exposure. At home, every shadow seemed to harbor watching eyes. I couldn't sleep without leaving all the lights on, and even then, dreams of Track 7 invaded my rest. Last night I returned to work. I told myself I needed answers, but the truth is simpler and more terrifying. The lights had begun appearing in my apartment. Just glimpses at first, a flash of amber in my peripheral vision, gone when I turned to look, but growing stronger, more persistent. They were following me now. Distance made no difference. As I write this in the security office, huddled under the harsh fluorescent lighting, I can see them through the window. Dozens of lights drifting across the yard, all converging on this building. My phone camera shows nothing, but I no longer need documentation. I know what I see is real. The lights have changed. They're brighter now, and within each orb, I can discern something moving, pressing against some membrane between worlds. Occasionally, I catch glimpses of what might be features, too angular, too fluid to be human faces, but faces nonetheless. Watching. Waiting. I understand now what M discovered over a century ago. The lights are not paranormal remnants or ghostly manifestations. They're observers from somewhere else, using these points of light as apertures to study our world. Track 7 is significant only because it's where they first found a way to look through, some weak point in whatever separates their reality from ours. For generations they've been watching, learning, and now, I believe, they're ready for more than observation. The radio on my desk crackles with static. Through the white noise, I can make out voices, distant, distorted, speaking words that almost make sense. The lights outside have completely surrounded the building, pressing closer to the windows, and I've made a terrifying realization. Every time I see them, there are more lights. Every time I acknowledge their presence, they grow stronger. They don't just watch anymore. They know I see them. They know I understand what they are. And now, God help me, they're starting to open. Story 5. The moment I stepped into the Willow Creek Inn, something felt wrong. Not in any obvious way. The lobby was quaint, with its antique furniture and faded floral wallpaper, but in that primal, instinctive way that makes the hairs on your neck rise. A heaviness hung in the air, as if the oxygen had been replaced with something thicker, something that clung to my lungs with each breath. I chalked it up to exhaustion from the 5-hour drive through winding mountain roads. A business trip to assess a potential acquisition site had brought me to this forgotten corner of rural America, where cell reception wavered between one bar and none. Mrs. Holloway, the innkeeper, was a gaunt woman with skin like crumpled parchment. Her eyes never quite met mine as she processed my reservation, her fingers trembling slightly as they moved across the ancient registry book. She assigned me to room 8, at the far end of the second-floor hallway. As she handed me an actual metal key, not a key card, her cold fingers brushed against mine. I suppressed a shudder. "Breakfast is at 7, she informed me in a voice as dry as autumn leaves. "And please, Mr. Garrett, remain in your room after midnight. The old floors, they creak something terrible, and our other guests value their sleep." I nodded, though something in her tone suggested this wasn't merely about noise concerns. As I gathered my bag to head upstairs, my gaze drifted to a narrow hallway branching off from the main corridor. At its end stood a door, different from the others. While the rest of the doors in the inn were painted a soft cream color, this one was an angry, deep crimson. A heavy padlock secured it, and what appeared to be small religious symbols, crosses, stars, and other markings I couldn't identify, were carved into its frame. Mrs. Holloway noticed my attention and coughed softly. When I asked about the door, her expression tightened, the wrinkles around her mouth deepening into crevices. That room, she explained in clipped tones, had been sealed for 43 years due to spiritual reasons. Before I could inquire further, she busied herself with paperwork, effectively ending our conversation. The abruptness of her dismissal only intensified my curiosity, but I respected her clear desire to change the subject. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. The air grew noticeably cooler with each step. My room was Spartan but clean, a double bed with an iron frame, a small writing desk by the window, and a bathroom that had last been updated sometime during the Reagan administration. I set my laptop on the desk, deciding to review some documents before dinner. The rural development project would be straightforward, but something about the location's isolation made our investors nervous. Now, surrounded by the pressing silence of the inn, I was beginning to understand their hesitation. That first night passed uneventfully, though my sleep was fitful. The mattress seemed to have memorized someone else's body, creating a subtle depression that kept rolling me to the center. At 3:17 a.m., I remember checking my watch. I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, measured, and oddly arrhythmic. Step, step, drag. Step, step, drag. I reminded myself of Mrs. Holloway's warning about the creaky floors and pulled the covers higher, trying to ignore how the footsteps paused briefly outside my door before continuing down the hall. The next day was consumed by meetings at the development site 2 miles down the road. By evening, a storm had rolled in, bringing sheets of rain that drummed against the windows of the inn. After a solitary dinner at the town's only diner, I returned to find the power out. Mrs. Holloway supplied me with candles, her face looking even more skeletal in the flickering light. She apologized for the inconvenience, explaining that storm-related outages were common in these parts. When I inquired about the backup generator I'd noticed behind the building, she stiffened, claiming it was reserved for essential systems. Before I could ask what that meant in a 12-room inn, she handed me a box of matches and retreated into the shadows. The candles cast elongated shadows across my room as I prepared for bed. The storm showed no signs of abating, and without the white noise of the ancient HVAC system, every sound in the old building was magnified. Water gurgled through pipes in the walls, wind whistled through some unseen gap in the window frame, and somewhere in the building, something, or someone, was moving. Around midnight, as I hovered in that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, I heard it for the first time. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was a branch against a window, but its regularity suggested something more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. It stopped for several minutes, then resumed, slightly louder, I sat up, straining to identify the source. It seemed to be coming from somewhere below me, perhaps the first floor. Sleep became impossible as my mind fixated on the sound. Eventually, I threw off the covers and grabbed my phone for its flashlight. Mrs. Holloway's warning echoed in my mind, but my curiosity overpowered my desire to be a considerate guest. I stepped into the hallway, the ancient floorboards announcing my every move despite my attempts at stealth. The tapping grew clearer as I descended the stairs. It was coming from down that narrow hallway, from behind that crimson door. As I approached, the sound changed. No longer a tapping, but a faint scratching, like fingernails against wood. Then it stopped altogether. I stood before the door, my flashlight beam illuminating the strange symbols carved into its frame. Up close, I noticed dark stains around the keyhole, long dried but still visible against the red paint. "Is someone there?" I whispered, feeling ridiculous but unable to help myself. Silence answered me. Then, just as I was about to return upstairs, a voice, so quiet I nearly convinced myself I'd imagined it, came from behind the door. "Please," it whispered. The word elongated into something barely recognizable. "Let me out." My heart hammered against my ribs. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead and back, soaking through my t-shirt. I told myself it was a trick of the wind, or perhaps another guest playing a prank. But deep down, I knew better. The voice had an otherworldly quality to it, like someone speaking through water or from a great distance. "Who's in there?" I asked, my own voice sounding foreign to my ears. More scratching, more insistent now. Then, "I've been waiting so long. Please, the key. Find the key." I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet. My rational mind raced through explanations, a squatter, a trapped animal, an elaborate hoax. But none satisfied the primitive part of my brain that was now screaming at me to run. Instead, I returned to my room, double-checking the lock before crawling back into bed. Sleep evaded me until dawn finally broke through the window. At breakfast, I studied Mrs. Holloway with new eyes. She moved about the small dining room with practiced efficiency, serving coffee and toast to the only other guests, an elderly couple who barely acknowledged my presence. When she approached my table, I casually mentioned hearing strange noises in the night. Her hand trembled as she refilled my coffee cup, dark liquid splashing onto the tablecloth. She insisted it was just the storm, the old building settling, nothing to worry about. But her eyes, now meeting mine with an intensity that hadn't been there before, told a different story. There was fear there, and something else. A warning. That day, rather than returning to the development site, I found myself at the local library, researching the history of Willow Creek Inn. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, hesitated when I mentioned where I was staying. She directed me to the local newspaper archives, her expression guarded as she suggested I look up articles from the summer of 1977. What I discovered sent ice through my veins. In June of that year, a traveling salesman named Richard Mercer had disappeared from the inn. His room had been found empty, his belongings untouched, his car still in the parking lot. The investigation had gone cold within weeks. But that wasn't all. There had been other disappearances over the years. Never enough to establish a pattern, but enough to raise questions. And all of the missing had been staying at the inn, all in room 12, the room with the crimson door. By the time I returned to the inn that evening, my mind was racing with theories, each more disturbing than the last. The rational part of me knew I should check out, find accommodations elsewhere for my remaining 2 nights. But something kept me there. A morbid curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper, something I couldn't yet identify. That night, the tapping began earlier, around 10 o'clock. It was more urgent now, no longer a tentative sound but a desperate one. I lay in bed, my entire body rigid with tension, listening as it evolved into a frantic scratching. Then came the voice again, louder this time. "Please, I know you're there. I can sense you. Help me." Despite every instinct warning me against it, I found myself once again standing in the hallway. drawn to that crimson door like a moth to flame. The scratching stopped as I approached. "Who are you?" I asked, pressing my palm against the weathered wood. A long pause. Then, "I don't remember anymore. It's been so long. So dark in here." My throat constricted, making it difficult to swallow. "What happened to you?" Another pause. "She tricked me. Said there was something I needed to see. Then the door, it locked behind me. She said it was necessary, that I was chosen." "Mrs. Holloway did this?" My voice was barely audible now. "Holloway. Yes, her family. Generations of them. They feed it, keep it satisfied. But it's hungry again. So hungry." A cold dread spread through my body like poison. "Feed what?" The voice changed then, becoming somehow less human. "Me." The scratching resumed, more frenetic, accompanied by a low guttural sound that might have been laughter or sobbing. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. The symbols carved into the doorframe began to glow with a faint, sickly light. I fled back to my room, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook violently as I threw my belongings into my suitcase. I had to leave now, tonight. But as I reached for the doorknob, a realization struck me with paralyzing force. The scratching sound was now coming from the other side of my own door. "You can't leave," Mrs. Holloway's voice drifted through the wood, sounding nothing like it had before. It was deeper, resonant with something ancient and terrible. "No one ever really leaves the Willow Creek Inn." The doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. I backed away until my legs hit the bed. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. My vision tunneled, the edges darkening as panic threatened to overwhelm me. Then, from somewhere deep within the building, a different sound emerged, a low, reverberating hum that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The doorknob stopped turning. Mrs. Holloway, or whatever was using her voice, cursed softly. "It's calling me back," she hissed. "But I'll return, and you'll still be here." Footsteps retreated down the hallway. I didn't move for what felt like hours, my body frozen in terror. Eventually, when the silence had stretched so long that I began to wonder if I'd imagined the entire encounter, I crept to the door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. With trembling fingers, I turned the lock and eased the door open just enough to peer into the hallway. It was empty, bathed in the pale blue light of dawn that filtered through a window at the far end. I gathered my courage in my suitcase and moved quietly toward the stairs. As I passed the crimson door, I paused. No sounds came from within, but on the floor before it lay a key, old and rusted, but unmistakably meant for that lock. Had Mrs. Holloway dropped it, or had it appeared through some other inexplicable means? For one mad moment I considered using it. My fingers actually reached for it before sanity reasserted itself. Whatever was behind that door, whether victim or predator or both, was part of something I couldn't comprehend and didn't want to. I left the key where it lay and continued toward the exit. Mrs. Holloway was nowhere to be seen as I passed through the lobby. The registration book lay open on the desk, and I noticed something that sent a fresh wave of horror through me. My name was the only one entered for the past week. There had been no elderly couple at breakfast. I drove away from Willow Creek Inn as the sun broke fully over the horizon, pushing my car well beyond the speed limit. In my rearview mirror, the inn grew smaller until it disappeared around a bend in the road. But even now, hundreds of miles away, I can still hear that voice in my dreams, still feel the oppressive weight of that place pressing down on me. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I imagine the crimson door. I wonder if someone else has found the key, if they were brave enough, or foolish enough, to turn it in the lock. And I wonder what exactly would be waiting for them on the other side, because one thing has become terribly clear to me. Whatever was behind that door wasn't trying to get out. It was trying to get me in. Story 6. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot of the Pinewood Mall. All shadows, that is, except for one. I noticed it immediately, an impossibility that my mind struggled to process. A tall, slender man in a dark suit stood beside a black sedan, his figure clearly illuminated by the dying sun behind him. But where there should have been a shadow stretching across the cracked asphalt, there was nothing, just empty pavement, as if light simply passed through him instead of being blocked. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, certain I was missing something. Everyone casts shadows. It's a fundamental law of physics, not something open to interpretation or exception. I'd stayed late at the office again, another mindless evening of spreadsheets and projections. The banality of my corporate existence had dulled my senses over the years, but something primal awakened in me as I observed this anomaly from the safety of my car. My fingers tightened around my keys, the metal biting into my palm as I debated whether to investigate or simply drive away. Curiosity won over caution, a decision I would soon regret. The temperature had dropped considerably since I'd entered the building that morning, and a thin layer of fog was beginning to roll in from the nearby lake, curling around the lampposts that had just flickered to life. I stepped out of my vehicle, the door closing behind me with a hollow thud that echoed across the empty lot. The sound seemed amplified in the stillness, yet the man by the sedan showed no reaction. As I approached, moving with deliberate casualness, the stranger suddenly jerked into motion, his movements oddly fluid, yet mechanical. He opened his car door and reached inside with unnatural haste, as though late for some critical appointment. What struck me most profoundly was the absolute silence of his movements. My own footsteps created small crunching sounds on the rough surface, but his produced nothing, not even the whisper of his suit fabric or the expected metal clatter of his car door. My throat constricted as I came within 20 feet of him. Something about his presence felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, like encountering a predator whose nature you recognize on an instinctual level before your conscious mind can name the danger. The hairs on the back of my neck stood rigid, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the chill in the air. I cleared my throat, intending to ask if he needed assistance, a transparent excuse for my approach. The words died before reaching my lips as the man straightened and turned partially toward me. His face remained in shadow despite the angle of the sunset, which should have illuminated his features. I could make out only the vague impression of eyes watching me from within that unnatural darkness. My heart hammered against my ribcage, its rhythm irregular and panicked. I wanted to retreat, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot as the shadowless man tilted his head, studying me with an intensity I could feel rather than see. A tremor began in my hands and spread up my arms as he took a single step in my direction. Again, the movement was completely silent. I managed to croak out a question about the time, an absurdly mundane inquiry given the circumstances. The man didn't respond verbally. Instead, he reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew something that gleamed momentarily in the fading light. My muscles tensed, preparing to flee, but he merely held up what appeared to be an antique pocket watch. The face of the timepiece was turned toward me, but I couldn't focus on it properly. The numbers seemed to shift and swim before my eyes, causing a wave of dizziness to wash over me. When I looked up from the disorienting watch face, the man had moved several steps closer without my noticing. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I realized he'd covered at least 10 feet without making a sound or seeming to actually walk the distance. It was as if reality had briefly skipped, and he'd simply appeared in a new position. I took an instinctive step backward, mumbling a hasty thanks as I began to retreat. The fog had grown thicker around us, reducing visibility to about 50 feet in any direction. The parking lot lamps created halos in the mist, their light diffused and weakened. As I continued backing away, I noticed another disturbing detail. The man's breath didn't create vapor in the cold air as mine did. Each of my exhales produced a small cloud, but he remained unnaturally still, neither breathing nor blinking as far as I could tell. My retreat quickened, no longer caring if I appeared frightened or rude. As the distance between us grew, I felt a momentary relief. until I glanced over my shoulder to locate my car and turned back to find the man had vanished. The black sedan remained, but its owner had disappeared in the seconds my attention had been diverted. My pulse skyrocketed, blood rushing in my ears as I spun in a complete circle, scanning the foggy lot for any sign of movement. Nothing. The parking area remained eerily silent except for the distant hum of traffic beyond the mall property. I broke into a run, no longer concerned with dignity or reason, focused solely on reaching my vehicle. As I fumbled with my keys, a reflection in my car window caused my blood to freeze. Standing directly behind me, impossibly close, was the shadowless man. I hadn't heard him approach, hadn't sensed his presence until that moment. My keys clattered to the ground as I whirled around, a strangled cry escaping my throat. The parking space behind me was empty. I snatched my keys from the asphalt, my fingers trembling so violently that it took 3 attempts to press the unlock button. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, its rumble providing minimal comfort in the growing darkness. As I pulled out of the parking space, my headlights swept across the lot, briefly illuminating the black sedan. The man stood beside it once more, in the exact position I'd first observed him, as though the entire interaction had never occurred. When my lights passed over him, I noticed something that sent a wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. The beams went through him rather than stopping at his form. The light hit the car behind him without casting his silhouette. My foot slammed on the accelerator, the tires screeching in protest as I fled the scene. During the drive home, I repeatedly checked my rearview mirror, convinced I would see the black sedan following me. The roads remained mercifully clear, but my panic didn't subside. My apartment offered little comfort when I arrived. I secured all locks, drew the blinds, and collapsed onto my couch, my body shaking with delayed shock. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the building, every distant siren or car door caused me to jolt upright, certain the shadowless man had somehow found my home. By morning, exhaustion had dulled my fear enough that I convinced myself I'd experienced some sort of stress-induced hallucination. The human mind is remarkably adept at rationalizing the impossible. I called in sick to work, unable to face the prospect of returning to that parking lot. Instead, I spent hours searching online for any mention of similar experiences or folklore about beings without shadows. The results were unsettling. Across cultures and centuries, shadowless entities featured prominently in supernatural legends. In some traditions, they were considered soul collectors. In others, beings from parallel dimensions that occasionally slipped into our reality. By afternoon, I'd nearly convinced myself that poor lighting conditions and fatigue had caused me to misinterpret what I'd seen. The rational explanation was that the angle of the sun had somehow obscured the man's shadow, and my stressed mind had fabricated the other unsettling details. This comforting delusion shattered when I went to make coffee and noticed my mail on the kitchen counter. Mail I hadn't brought in. Among the usual bills and advertisements lay a small cream-colored envelope with no postmark or address. My fingers felt numb as I opened it, already knowing what I would find. Inside was a business card. No name, no phone number, just an address printed in elegant script and a time, 7:30 p.m. I recognized the address as an old theater downtown that had been closed for renovation for years. The card's paper felt wrong against my skin, too cold, with an unnatural smoothness that made my fingers recoil. I told myself I wouldn't go. Only a fool would follow such an invitation after experiencing what I had. Yet as evening approached, an irresistible compulsion grew within me. My curiosity, or perhaps something darker, pulled me toward that address with gravitational force. The theater stood in a neglected part of downtown, its once grand facade now crumbling and defaced with graffiti. Construction equipment sat abandoned around the building, covered in a layer of dust that suggested work had halted long ago. The marquee, missing most of its letters, hung precariously above the boarded-up entrance. I arrived at 7:25, parking a block away out of some instinctive caution. As I approached on foot, I noticed something odd. The theater appeared completely dark from the outside, yet slivers of light escaped from the edges of the entrance doors. My mouth went dry as I reached for the handle, expecting it to be locked. It opened silently, inviting me into a dimly lit lobby. The interior defied the building's external appearance. Where I expected to find construction materials in decay, I instead encountered an immaculately preserved lobby from another era. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting a warm glow over red velvet carpets and ornate gold-leafed walls. The air smelled of leather and faint perfume, with an underlying mustiness suggesting the space had been sealed for decades. Most disturbing was the absolute silence. No creaking floorboards, no distant street noise penetrated this space. The silence felt tangible, pressing against my eardrums like cotton wool. My breathing seemed thunderous by comparison, each exhale an intrusion in this perfect stillness. A single door stood open at the far end of the lobby, leading into the main auditorium. As I approached it, the familiar sensation of being watched intensified. My legs moved on their own accord, carrying me forward despite every instinct screaming for retreat. The auditorium stretched before me, rows of empty seats facing a stage draped with heavy curtains. A single spotlight illuminated center stage, where the shadowless man stood motionless. From this distance, I still couldn't make out his features clearly, but I could feel his gaze fixed on me. My feet carried me down the aisle toward him, my heart pounding so violently I feared it might burst from my chest. As I reached the front row, the man gestured to the empty seat directly before him. I sank into it, unable to resist the silent command. He began to speak, though his lips didn't move. His voice resonated directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. He explained that he had been watching me for some time, not just days or weeks, but years. He described moments from my past with perfect clarity. Childhood incidents I'd forgotten, private moments I'd never shared, thoughts I'd believed were mine alone. What he offered next was both tempting and horrifying. He proposed to remove my shadow, to free me from what he called the burden of physical consequence. Without a shadow, he claimed, I would exist partially outside normal reality. Time would loosen its grip on me. Physical limitations would diminish. I would become like him, a walker between worlds. The cost, he finally revealed, would be paid in memories, not all at once but gradually, over what would feel like centuries from my perspective. He would feed on these memories, sustaining himself on the emotional energy contained within them. Eventually, when all meaningful memories were consumed, I would become as he was, a collector seeking new shadows to harvest. I wanted to refuse, to flee this nightmare theater and return to my mundane existence. But as he spoke, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't remember how I'd arrived here. The memory of driving downtown had already been taken as a down payment. Panic surged through me as I tried to recall my apartment number, my mother's face, my own middle name. All were becoming hazy, slipping away like water through open fingers. With tremendous effort, I forced myself from the seat, my legs wobbling beneath me. The shadowless man made no move to stop me as I staggered backward up the aisle. His voice continued in my mind, assuring me that he would wait. Time meant nothing to him. When the emptiness of my existence became too much to bear, he would be there to offer his bargain again. I burst through the theater doors into the night air, gulping it down like a drowning man. The street looked different somehow. The buildings older, the cars unfamiliar models. A newspaper in a nearby trash can bore yesterday's date, but the year was wrong. 3 years before what I remembered. As I walked the unfamiliar streets of my hometown, fragments of memory returned, though with disturbing gaps. I couldn't remember what I did for work or the names of my friends. My past had become a puzzle with vital pieces missing. I stopped beneath a street lamp, suddenly aware of something crucial. Slowly, dreading what I might see, I looked down at the pavement around my feet. My shadow was intact, but changed. Its edges were blurred, indistinct in a way that human shadows aren't. And as I watched, it seemed to move slightly out of sync with my body, with subtle, independent movements that shadows should never make. I don't know if I escaped, or if this is merely the first stage of his process. Perhaps he's allowing me to keep part of my shadow as a tether, one he can reel in when he decides the time is right. Sometimes, in unguarded moments, I hear his voice whispering suggestions, Observations about how hollow human connections feel, how meaningless the passage of time seems. I find myself drawn to empty parking lots at sunset, watching for others like him, or perhaps watching for potential shadows to harvest myself. I don't know how much time I have before I fully become what he is. All I know is that I catch myself sometimes, standing still for hours, watching strangers from a distance. And when they look my way, I notice their unease as they realize my shadow doesn't quite match my movements. That's when I feel hungry. Story 7. The first creak came from somewhere near the front door. I froze, spoon suspended halfway to my mouth, soup going cold. Nobody else should be here. I'd made certain of that when I arrived 3 days ago. My grandparents' abandoned country house had stood empty for 11 years. I was the first to return. The second creak followed the first, then another, and another, forming a slow, deliberate path across what I knew to be the foyer's ancient oak floorboards. Each sound carried weight, the unmistakable pressure of footsteps, not the random settling of an old house, but the purposeful progression of something heavy moving through space. I didn't investigate that first night. Fear had paralyzed me, sending cold ripples down my spine, my breathing shallow and quick. I waited, counting the sounds until they stopped, directly overhead, above what had become my bedroom. When I finally gathered the courage to check the house, I found nothing disturbed, no doors unlocked, no windows opened, just dust, silence, and the lingering sensation of being watched. That was just the beginning. I'd come to my grandparents' house with a simple purpose: to renovate and sell it. The property had languished on the market for years, the isolated location and dilapidated conditions scaring away potential buyers. My plan was to spend 6 weeks here, making essential repairs before listing it again. I never expected what awaited me. The house itself, a sprawling 2-story Victorian with wraparound porches and too many rooms, had always possessed an unsettling quality, even in my childhood memories. Back then, visits had been brief, uncomfortable weekends filled with my grandfather's stern silences and my grandmother's nervous fluttering. The place never felt like a true home, more like a museum where I wasn't permitted to touch anything. Now, as the sole inheritor after my father's passing, it had fallen to me to handle this final piece of family business. On the second night, the pattern repeated. At exactly 3:12 a.m., according to my phone's glowing display, the first creak emerged from the entryway. My body went rigid beneath the thin blanket, sweat immediately beating across my forehead despite the room's chill. The steady progression of creaks mapped a specific route, from the front door, across the foyer, up the main staircase, down the second-floor hallway, and finally stopping outside my room. At 3:15 a.m., the footsteps halted, directly beside where I lay paralyzed. I counted 60 seconds of silence before the pressure in my chest forced me to gasp for air. My heart hammered so violently I could see my t-shirt jumping with each beat. When I finally swept my flashlight across the room and hallway, I confirmed what logic insisted must be true. I was completely alone. The next morning, I questioned my perception. Perhaps old houses simply made these noises. Maybe the isolation was affecting my mind, transforming ordinary settling sounds into something sinister. I'd spent too many years in city apartments where noise meant neighbors and human activity, not emptiness and decay. I methodically inspected the house in daylight. The floors did creak, but randomly and with much less force than what I'd heard in the darkness. I checked for loose boards along the exact path I'd heard traveled. Nothing. No evidence supported what my senses had experienced. That afternoon, I drove into town for supplies, stopping at the local diner for coffee. When the waitress asked what brought me to Millfield, I mentioned renovating my grandparents' place, the old Wilson house on Crooked Mile Road. The subtle shift in her expression made my stomach tighten. She asked if I was staying there nights. When I confirmed I was, she simply refilled my cup without commenting, but her eyes held something, pity perhaps, or concern. I pressed for more information, but she deflected with practiced skill, suggesting I speak with Edgar at the Historical Society if I wanted to know about the house. I didn't go to the historical society. Some stubborn part of me rejected the idea that anything supernatural was occurring. I'd never believed in ghosts. The scientific mind I'd cultivated through years of engineering work refused to entertain such possibilities. That night, I left every light blazing, radio playing, and positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of the foyer. I'd catch whatever was making those sounds. Around midnight, exhaustion pulled at me, my eyelids growing heavy despite my determination. I fought it, brewing another pot of coffee, pacing the worn carpet. By 3 a.m. I felt wired, jittery, but intensely alert. 3:12 a.m. arrived. Nothing happened. The absence of sound felt more threatening than the previous night's footsteps. My body remained tense, skin prickling with anticipation, ears straining for any disturbance. Minutes stretched. 3:15 passed in silence. 3:20. 3:30. Nothing. Relief gradually loosened my rigid posture. Perhaps it had been my imagination after all, or some weather-related phenomenon that had resolved itself. I allowed myself a small, self-deprecating smile. All this anxiety over nothing. That's when the overhead light flickered once, twice, then extinguished completely. The radio died simultaneously, plunging the house into darkness and silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. In that perfect darkness came the first creak from directly behind me. I scrambled forward, knocking over the coffee table, my shin connecting painfully with its edge. The next creak followed, closer, and the next. Something was approaching me in the darkness, each heavy step bringing it nearer. My body flooded with adrenaline, heart slamming painfully against my ribs. My mouth dried instantly, tongue sticking to the roof as I tried to scream but produced only a choked whimper. I fumbled for my phone, fingers trembling so violently I dropped it twice before activating the flashlight. The beam cut through darkness, revealing nothing. Empty space where sound insisted something stood. Yet the footsteps continued, now circling me. I spun wildly, light slashing through shadows, revealing only antique furniture and dusty corners. My rational mind collapsed beneath the weight of impossibility, terror crowding out logical thought. I backed against a wall, feeling the vibration of each approaching step through the soles of my feet. The footsteps stopped directly before me. I felt a pocket of cold air, like standing before an open freezer. My light revealed nothing but empty space, yet every sense screamed that something stood there watching, evaluating. I bolted. Primal instinct overrode paralysis, sending me scrambling toward the front door. My sweaty hand slipped twice on the knob before I wrenched it open, tumbling onto the porch. I spent the remainder of that night in my car, doors locked, engine running, heat blasting against the inexplicable cold that had settled into my bones. Dawn brought clarity of a sort. I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something compelled me to understand what haunted that house. If I fled now, I suspected it would follow me in nightmares for the rest of my life. That morning, I finally visited the Historical Society. Edgar, a stooped man with rheumy eyes and tobacco-stained fingers, recognized the address immediately. My grandfather had purchased the property in 1963, but its history extended back to 1887. Edgar reluctantly shared what he knew, his voice dropping to near whispers despite us being alone in the dusty archive room. The original owner had been obsessed with time. Howard Thatcher, a clockmaker by trade, had installed mechanical clocks in every room, all synchronized to chime simultaneously. According to local stories, Thatcher would patrol the house each night at exactly 3:12 a.m., checking each timepiece, following a precise route that ended at the master bedroom at exactly 3:15. When Edgar mentioned that Thatcher had eventually been committed to an asylum after claiming something was following his rounds, my skin erupted in gooseflesh. I pressed for more details, learning that subsequent owners had reported similar experiences, footsteps following Thatcher's nightly route. Some fled within weeks. Others stayed, gradually becoming withdrawn, paranoid, convinced they were being stalked through their own home. My grandfather had never reported such experiences, at least not publicly, but memories of his perpetual scowl, his insistence on silence after dark, his bedroom door secured with multiple locks. They took on new significance. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the house. Part of me recognized the insanity of going back, but something stronger than fear drove me. The need to confront what had terrified generations of occupants, including, I now suspected, my own family. I spent that afternoon preparing. I couldn't fight what I couldn't see, but perhaps I could communicate with it. I researched local history further, discovering that Thatcher had died in the asylum, still insisting that time itself has become corrupted in that house. His final ravings described something ancient that had attached itself to his routine, learning it, mimicking it, and eventually attempting to replace him. That night, I positioned myself in my bedroom, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the bed. No lights, no distractions. Just the darkness and my thundering heart. My phone displayed the time. 3:11 a.m. 1 minute passed with excruciating slowness. At exactly 3:12, the first creak sounded from the entryway below. Each subsequent step followed the now familiar route. I focused on controlling my breathing, fighting the urge to flee as the footsteps ascended the stairs, traversed the hallway, and approached my room. 3:15 a.m. The footsteps stopped beside me. Cold air swirled around my rigid form. I spoke into the darkness, voice cracking. I know about Thatcher. I know about his rounds. The silence that followed felt evaluative. The temperature dropped further, my breath fogging before my face. "This isn't your house anymore," I continued, each word requiring immense effort to push past my constricted throat. "You need to break this pattern." Something shifted in the darkness. Not physically. The air itself seemed to change density, pressing against my skin like standing in deep water. My ears popped painfully as though altitude had suddenly changed. The wooden floor beneath me groaned, not with the sharp creak of footsteps, but a prolonged, straining sound of pressure beyond what boards should withstand. My phone screen flickered, the display blurring, numbers shifting rapidly before settling on a repeating pattern. 3:15, 3:15, 3:15. Understanding bloomed with horrifying clarity. Whatever presence occupied this house wasn't following Thatcher's routine. It was trapped in it, endlessly repeating the same 3 minutes. And worse, it wanted company in its endless loop. I felt it then, a subtle tugging sensation, as though invisible threads were attaching themselves to my limbs, urging me to stand, to walk the route, to become part of the pattern. My muscles twitched with alien impulses, my foot sliding forward without conscious command. Panic surged through me. I scrambled backward, breaking whatever influence had begun to take hold. The cold intensified, rage permeating the air like an electrical charge. Objects on my nightstand vibrated, then flew across the room, smashing against walls. The mirror on the closet door cracked in a perfect spiderweb pattern. I fled the room, but the footsteps followed, no longer adhering to their traditional path, but pursuing me directly. Whatever rules had bound this entity were changing. I had challenged its routine, and now it was adapting. I reached the front door, fingers closing around the knob, when every clock in the house, clocks I hadn't even known existed, hidden behind walls, under floorboards, within furniture, began to chime simultaneously. The cacophony froze me in place long enough for the footsteps to catch up, stopping directly behind me. The door swung open on its own, revealing not the porch and yard beyond, but a distorted version of the house's foyer, the same space I was currently standing in, yet somehow different. Older, newer, existing in multiple time frames simultaneously. And in that impossible space stood a figure checking a pocket watch, his face obscured by shadows that shouldn't exist. He looked up slowly, empty eye sockets fixing on mine, jaw opening to reveal darkness where a mouth should be. His hand extended, offering the watch, inviting me to take his place in the endless patrol of this house where time had fractured. I slammed the door shut with every ounce of strength I possessed. The resulting bang echoed with finality, followed by absolute silence. No footsteps, no clock chimes, nothing but my ragged breathing and racing heart. I didn't wait for morning. I drove straight to the county clerk's office when they opened, signing papers to donate the property to the Historical Society, with strict conditions that it never be occupied again. When Edgar asked why, I could only shake my head, unable to articulate what I'd experienced. I still wake at 3:15 a.m. every night, body tense, listening for footsteps that never come. My new apartment has no wooden floors, yet sometimes I imagine I feel vibrations through the concrete, like something pacing below, searching. I've thrown away every clock I owned, relying only on my phone for time, yet I never check it between 3:00 and 3:30 a.m. Time functions differently in that house on Crooked Mile Road. It bends, loops, traps. Whatever walks those floors isn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It's something older, something that existed before the house was built, something that learned to use human patterns to move through our world. And sometimes, in the liminal space between wakefulness and dreams, I can still feel those threads pulling at me, urging me to return and resume the route I narrowly escaped, the route that always begins at 3:12 and ends at a destination I never want to reach. In Story 8. And the first night I spent in my uncle's farmhouse, I woke to the sound of my name, not shouted, not whispered, but called with the casual familiarity of someone who knows you'll answer. It drifted through my open window, carried on the still night air like a thread of smoke finding its way through the darkness. I dismissed it as a dream and rolled over. But then it came again. My name, spoken from somewhere outside, somewhere below. That's when I remembered the well. I had discovered it earlier that day while exploring the overgrown property I'd inherited from my uncle Sebastian, a man I'd met only twice in my life. The well sat at the edge of a small clearing about 50 yards from the house, its stone rim crumbling with age, its opening haphazardly covered with weathered wooden planks. I hadn't given it much thought at the time, just another feature of the decrepit rural property that now inexplicably belonged to me. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to my name being called from somewhere in the night, the image of that covered well burned in my mind with sudden, terrible clarity. Sleep abandoned me after that. I lay rigid in the unfamiliar bed, my ears straining against the silence, waiting for my name to drift through the window again. It didn't come, but something else did. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on glass, like stone on stone, like something climbing. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The harsh light of day made the night's terrors seem ridiculous. I told myself it had been the wind, or some nocturnal animal, or simply the product of sleeping in a strange place. The farmhouse settled and creaked in ways I wasn't used to. The rural darkness was absolute in a way my city eyes found disorienting. That was all. I spent the day sorting through my uncle's belongings. Sebastian had been something of a recluse in his later years, according to the lawyer who handled his will. The house reflected this, cluttered with books, strange artifacts, and handwritten journals filled with increasingly paranoid ramblings about the voices from below and eyes that watch from the darkness. I dismissed these as the ravings of a lonely old man whose grip on reality had slipped in his isolation. Still, a chill ran down my spine when I found a notebook containing detailed sketches of the well, along with what appeared to be transcriptions of conversations. One-sided conversations, with my uncle's words recorded in his precise handwriting, and blank spaces where another's responses should have been. That night, I made sure to close the window before going to bed. I even wedged a chair under the doorknob, though I felt foolish doing it. I was a grown man, for God's sake, not some child afraid of monsters under the bed. But something about this place got under my skin. The isolation, perhaps. The knowledge that my eccentric uncle had died here alone, his body undiscovered for days. Or maybe it was those journals, with their talk of voices from the well. I woke again in the darkest part of the night. The chair still secured the door. The window remained closed. But unmistakably, impossibly, I heard my name being called. Not from outside this time, but from within the house. From the hallway just beyond my bedroom door. My throat constricted with fear as I watched the doorknob slowly turn against the resistance of the chair. Once, twice, then stillness. My heart hammered against my ribs as sweat beaded on my forehead. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but my voice seemed trapped in my chest. The rational part of my mind insisted there was no one in the house. I had checked every room before retiring, had secured every door and window. Yet the doorknob had turned. I had seen it. Morning found me exhausted and on edge. I searched the house methodically, room by room, finding nothing out of place. No signs of an intruder. No footprints in the dust that seemed to coat everything in this neglected place. I was alone, or should have been. I decided to investigate the well in daylight. Armed with a flashlight and fighting against every instinct that urged me to leave this place, I approached the covered opening. The wooden planks looked older than I had initially thought, rotted and warped with age and exposure. Several appeared to have been recently moved and replaced, the disturbed dust around them telling a story I wasn't sure I wanted to read. I removed one of the boards, ignoring the trembling in my hands. The opening breathed out at me, a rush of stale, cold air that carried the unmistakable scent of decay. I shined my flashlight into the darkness, but the beam couldn't penetrate all the way to the bottom. All I could see was a circle of crumbling stone disappearing into blackness. The idea came to me suddenly, the camera. I had a small digital camera with a decent night vision function. If I lowered it down on a rope, I could see what was at the bottom of the well without risking getting too close. The rational part of my brain told me this was unnecessary, that old wells were commonplace on rural properties, that there was nothing sinister about a hole in the ground. But I couldn't shake the memory of my name being called in the night, or the turning doorknob, or my uncle's disturbing journals. It took me an hour to rig up a suitable contraption. I found some rope in a storage shed and attached the camera securely, setting it to record video. With shaking hands, I removed more of the boards covering the well and began lowering the camera into the darkness. The rope slid through my fingers foot by foot as the camera descended. 20 feet, 30, 50. How deep was this thing? Finally, the tension on the rope eased, telling me the camera had reached the bottom. I gave it a few minutes to record, then carefully pulled it back up. My hands were slick with sweat despite the cool autumn air, and more than once I feared I might drop the rope and lose the camera forever in the darkness below. When it finally emerged into the sunlight, I clutched it like a lifeline. Back in the house, I connected the camera to my laptop and played the recording. The first minute showed nothing but the stone walls of the well sliding past as the camera descended. Then darkness. Complete darkness. I was about to fast forward when something caught my eye. A glint. A reflection, perhaps. I rewound and played it again at a slower speed. There. 2 pinpricks of light in the blackness. Reflections from the camera's infrared, I told myself. I enhanced the image, increasing the brightness and contrast. The picture clarified, and my blood turned to ice. Standing at the bottom of the well was a figure. Human in shape, but wrong somehow. Too thin, too still. And those points of light were not reflections. They were eyes, catching the infrared in a way that human eyes should not. The figure stood motionless, face upturned toward the camera, toward me. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood and stared with those impossible gleaming eyes. I slammed the laptop shut and backed away from it as if it might be contaminated. My mind raced with explanations, a trick of the light, a flaw in the recording, my exhausted brain interpreting random patterns as a human figure. But none of these explanations could account for the cold dread that now filled my chest, or the certainty that whatever stood at the bottom of that well had been watching me since my arrival. I spent the day in a state of agitation, alternating between convincing myself I had imagined it all and obsessively reviewing the footage frame by frame. In the clearest still I could extract, the figure looked almost translucent, its edges blurring into the darkness around it. But those eyes, those remained sharply defined, 2 perfect points of light in the blackness. I considered leaving, packing my things and driving back to the city, forgetting this inheritance and all its strange burdens. But something held me there. Curiosity, perhaps, or the nagging sense that running away wouldn't end this, that whatever had begun when I arrived would follow me. In my uncle's study, I found more journals. Earlier ones, from when he first moved to the farmhouse 15 years ago. He wrote of the same experiences, his name called in the night, strange sounds in the house, the feeling of being watched, and the well. Always the well. He had tried to fill it in once, he wrote, but the next day found all the dirt and stones removed, the well as deep and dark as ever. He had covered it with concrete, only to find the covering shattered days later as if struck from below with enormous force. Eventually he settled for the wooden boards, a barrier more symbolic than functional, and he began answering when his name was called. The conversations recorded in his journals grew increasingly bizarre. He wrote of a bargain made, of knowledge given in exchange for companionship, of secrets whispered up from the darkness that no living human should know. And in the final journal, the one I had discovered on my first day, he wrote of inviting his nephew, of inviting me, to inherit the property. He knew his time was ending, he wrote. The thing in the well had told him so, and it needed a new companion. Night fell too quickly. I secured the house as best I could, checking and rechecking locks and windows. I brought my uncle's journals into the bedroom with me, along with a kitchen knife that offered little reassurance. Outside, clouds obscured the moon and stars, wrapping the farmhouse in perfect darkness. I didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion claimed me sometime after midnight, and inevitably, I woke to the sound of my name. It came not from outside, not from the hallway, but from directly beside my bed. A voice like stone grinding against stone, like water rushing over rocks, like nothing human. My eyes snapped open to darkness. The knife lay on the bedside table just inches from my hand, but I couldn't move to reach for it. Paralysis gripped me, whether from fear or some influence I couldn't name. And though I saw nothing in the darkness of the room, I felt a presence, a weight in the air beside me, cold and ancient and patient. It spoke again, my name in that terrible voice, so close now that I should have felt breath against my face. But there was no breath, only a bone-deep cold that seemed to leach the warmth from my skin. I tried to scream, but my lungs refused to obey. I lay there, helpless, as something cold and rough and not quite solid brushed against my cheek. Then, mercifully, consciousness fled. I woke with the dawn, my body aching as if I'd run for miles. The knife remained on the bedside table, undisturbed. The room looked normal in the pale morning light, no sign of the nocturnal visitor that had left me frozen with terror. Only a lingering chill in the air suggested it had been anything more than a nightmare. On trembling legs, I made my way to the kitchen and put coffee on to brew, trying to think through my options. I could leave, should leave, but something told me that would only delay the inevitable. Whatever had attached itself to my uncle had now fixed its attention on me. The property, the inheritance, the invitation to come here, it had all been part of some design I was only beginning to understand. My uncle's final journal entry replayed in my mind. It needs a new companion. As if pulled by an invisible thread, I found myself walking toward the well. The wooden boards lay scattered around it, though I had carefully replaced them the day before. The opening gaped like an open mouth, darkness breathing out into the morning air. I approached it hesitantly, half expecting to see the figure from the camera footage standing at the bottom, looking up at me with those gleaming eyes. Instead, I saw something that stopped my heart. A rope ladder, old but sturdy, now hung down into the well. It hadn't been there yesterday. I was certain of that. Yet there it was, an invitation, a way down. And there, scratched into the stone rim of the well in fresh raw marks, was my name. I stood at the edge, looking down into the darkness. The cold air rising from the depths carried whispers just below the threshold of hearing, almost words that tickled at the edges of my consciousness. I thought of my uncle, living alone in this house for 15 years with only the thing in the well for company. I thought of the bargain he mentioned, the secrets shared, the knowledge given. I thought of his final act, bringing me here to take his place. I should leave. Pack my bags, get in my car, and drive away from this place and never look back. Sell the property unseen, or better yet, burn the house to the ground and salt the earth where the well stands. That would be the sane choice, the right choice. But as I stand here in the growing light of day, the rope ladder swaying gently in a breeze I cannot feel, I find myself considering the alternative. What secrets could be waiting in the darkness below? What knowledge was worth my uncle's isolation and eventual fate? What might be worth mine? I look back at the house, at the normal world beyond this property, at the life I could return to. Then I look again into the well, at the darkness that calls my name in the night with a voice like stone and water. And I begin to understand why my uncle stayed. My hand reaches for the rope ladder almost of its own accord. The wood is smooth beneath my fingers, worn by use I can only imagine. One rung, then another. The sunlight above grows distant as I descend into the cool darkness, toward the figure that I know waits below, toward the eyes that gleam in the blackness, toward answers, or madness, or something beyond either. The darkness rises to meet me like an old friend, and somewhere in its depths, something speaks my name once more. Story 9. The cold has a way of making silence tangible. It hangs in the air, crystallizes your breath, and turns the darkness into something you can almost touch. That's what I remember most about that night on the abandoned railway. The silence before it happened. The kind of silence that feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to begin. I've always been drawn to forgotten places. There's something about the way nature reclaims what humans leave behind that speaks to me. So when I discovered the old tourist railway that wound through the foothills just outside of town, I couldn't resist exploring it. The line had been abandoned for nearly 40 years, according to local history. A once popular scenic route that showcased the area's natural beauty before financial troubles shut it down in the 1980s. During the day, the trail was pleasant enough. Rusted tracks peeking through overgrown grass, wooden ties rotting beneath decades of rain and snow, the occasional broken signal post standing like a sentinel over the wilderness. But I'd heard from other urban explorers that the real experience came at night, when the forest embraced the railway in darkness and the boundary between past and present seemed to thin. That's why I found myself walking the tracks at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, armed with nothing but a flashlight and an unhealthy curiosity. The temperature had dropped suddenly after sunset, leaving the air crisp and sharp in my lungs. My breath formed clouds that dissipated into the darkness as I followed the tracks deeper into the forest, away from the distant glow of the town. The path curved gently through stands of pine trees, their silhouettes looming overhead like watching figures. My flashlight beam caught the occasional glint of metal where the tracks hadn't yet surrendered to rust. The weak moonlight filtered through branches, casting strange, shifting shadows across the ground. I paused occasionally to photograph interesting remnants. A twisted piece of metal that might have once been part of a switch mechanism, the crumbling foundation of what looked like a small station platform. 2 miles in, the forest opened to reveal a short trestle bridge spanning a shallow ravine. I checked my phone, no service as expected, and noted the time, 12:14 a.m. The bridge looked solid enough, the wooden ties weathered but intact. I played my flashlight across the structure, watching how the beam disappeared into the void beneath. Something about crossing that bridge made my skin prickle with apprehension, but I dismissed it as the natural unease of being alone in the wilderness at night. The first sign that something was wrong came as I reached the middle of the bridge. The metal tracks beneath my feet began to vibrate, subtle at first, so slight I thought I might be imagining it, but growing more pronounced with each passing second. A low rumble rose from somewhere in the distance behind me, not quite a sound but more a feeling in my bones. I froze, confusion flooding my mind. This line hadn't seen a train in decades. The tracks weren't connected to any active railway. There was nothing that could be causing this vibration, this feeling of an approaching train. Yet the vibration intensified. The rails hummed, and small pebbles along the track bed began to dance. The rumble deepened, resolving into the unmistakable rhythm of wheels on tracks. A train was coming, impossible as it seemed. Instinct took over. I scrambled toward the far side of the bridge, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as panic surged through my veins. The trestle offered no safe place to stand aside. The drop to either side was at least 15 feet onto rocky ground. My heart hammered against my ribs as I broke into a sprint, desperate to clear the bridge before whatever was coming reached me. As I leapt onto solid ground on the far side, the vibrations reached their peak. I spun around, expecting to see headlights cutting through the darkness. But there were none. No lights, no smoke, no screeching brakes or hissing steam. Just the unmistakable presence of something massive moving along the tracks. I backpedaled into the tree line, stumbling over roots and underbrush until my back pressed against the rough bark of a pine. From this vantage point, I could see the length of the bridge and the curve of tracks beyond. The vibrations continued, the rails singing with tension, yet nothing visible approached. Until suddenly, it was there. The first car emerged from the darkness like a shadow separating from the night itself. An ancient passenger car, its wooden frame weathered to a dull gray, windows glowing with a pale bluish light that illuminated nothing around it. It moved with impossible silence. No clickety-clack of wheels, no squeal of metal on metal, just the continuous vibration through the ground. My breath caught in my throat as more cars appeared, each identical to the first. 5, 6, 7 of them, plus what I assumed was a locomotive at the front, though I could barely make out its shape in the darkness. The train moved slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had slowed around it. As the first car crossed the bridge and drew parallel to my hiding place, I saw them. Passengers, dozens of them, sitting upright in their seats, visible through those glowing windows. Men in old-fashioned suits with high collars, women in long dresses with their hair pinned up in styles from another century. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and completely expressionless, and every single one of them was looking directly at me. Not just in my general direction, they were tracking me, their heads turning in perfect unison as each car passed my position. Their eyes, God, their eyes, were dark hollows that reflected the pale blue light. Not blinking, not moving, just fixed on me with an intensity that sent waves of cold terror washing over my body. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee back down the tracks, back to my car, back to the safety of electric lights and other human beings. But my legs refused to move. I stood frozen, pinned by those hollow gazes as car after car drifted past. Then I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. In each successive car, the passengers looked progressively more wrong. In the second car, their skin had taken on a grayish tinge. In the third, dark stains marred their clothing. By the fourth car, their formal postures had slackened slightly, heads tilting at unnatural angles. The fifth car's occupants had blackened skin that clung too tightly to their facial bones, eyes sunken deep into their sockets. Yet still they watched me. Still they tracked my position with that terrible, hungry focus. I pressed myself harder against the tree, as if I could somehow melt into its trunk and disappear from their sight. My fingernails dug into the bark until they bled. My breath came in short, desperate gasps that clouded before my face, briefly obscuring the nightmare passing before me. The final car was the worst. Its occupants barely resembled humans anymore. Withered forms with skin like ancient parchment stretched over bone, mouths hanging open in silent screams, limbs twisted into impossible positions. Yet somehow, they still managed to turn those horrible skull-like faces toward me as they passed. And then, as the last car drifted beyond the bridge, the train began to slow. A whimper escaped my lips as the final car ground to a halt just 50 yards past my position. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. The train sat motionless on the tracks, emitting that ghostly blue glow. No sound came from it. No hiss of brakes. No call of a conductor. Not even the normal settling noises of a large vehicle coming to rest. Just silence. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that sent fresh terror coursing through me, the door of the last car swung open. A set of metal steps unfolded toward the ground, and framed in the doorway stood a figure. It had once been a conductor, I think. The tattered remains of a uniform hung from its emaciated frame. A cap sat atop its skull-like head, tilted at a jaunty angle that seemed obscene on such a cadaverous form. It stood completely still for a moment, silhouetted against that pale blue light. Then it turned its head. Just its head, the body remaining rigidly forward, and those empty eye sockets found me in the darkness. It raised one skeletal hand and beckoned to me. A scream built in my throat, but what emerged was barely a whisper. My legs finally remembered how to move. I turned and crashed through the underbrush, away from the tracks, away from that thing and its terrible invitation. Branches whipped against my face. Roots threatened to trip me with every step, but blind panic drove me forward. I have no memory of how long I ran or which direction I took. At some point I realized I'd lost my flashlight, but terror propelled me onward through the darkness. Eventually my foot caught on something solid, a rock or fallen log, sending me sprawling face first onto the forest floor. The impact stunned me, knocking the wind from my lungs. As I lay there gasping, face pressed into the cold earth, the sound of my own desperate breathing gradually resolved into the only sound in the forest. The vibrations had stopped. Whatever presence had filled the air was gone. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I pushed myself to my knees. Blood trickled from a cut above my eye, and every muscle screamed in protest. In the distance I could make out the faint glow of lights, the town, though from an angle I didn't recognize. I'd run in a different direction than I'd come. Using my phone's dim light, I stumbled toward civilization. When I finally reached a road and flagged down a passing truck, the driver looked at me like I was insane. Covered in dirt and blood, clothes torn, babbling about ghost trains. He reluctantly gave me a ride back to where I'd parked my car, his expression growing increasingly concerned as I fell into long stretches of silence, jumping at every shadow we passed. The local sheriff heard my story the next day. He was polite enough, but I recognized the look in his eyes. The look that said he was humoring me, that perhaps I'd had too much to drink or taken something that altered my perceptions. He mentioned how the mind can play tricks in the forest at night, how the old railway had its share of urban legends. But then he said something that made my skin crawl all over again, mentioned almost casually that in 1923, before the line became a tourist attraction, there had been an accident. A passenger train had derailed at the trestle bridge, plunging into the ravine below. The fire that followed had been visible for miles. They'd never recovered all the bodies. I checked the historical records after that, found yellowed newspaper clippings and faded photographs in the town library's archives. The accident had occurred on October 23, 1923, exactly 101 years to the day before my encounter. The photos showed the aftermath: twisted metal, charred timbers, body bags lined up along the tracks, and one image, partially damaged but still legible, of the train before the accident. Passengers posed proudly beside the cars, dressed in their finest clothes for the inaugural journey along the new scenic route. Their faces stared out from the faded photograph, looking exactly as I remembered them from the first car. I've moved away from that town now, put as much distance as possible between myself and that abandoned railway. But distance doesn't help with the dreams. In them, I'm always back on that trestle bridge as the vibrations begin, back hiding in the trees as that procession of decay passes before me, back watching as the conductor turns its hollow eyes toward me and raises its bony hand in invitation. And in the dreams, sometimes I accept. Sometimes I step forward and climb those metal steps into the final car. Sometimes I take my place among those withered passengers and turn my face to the window, watching for the next solitary figure walking the tracks at night. Sometimes I find myself wondering if I actually did, because ever since that night, people seem to look through me rather than at me. Conversations halt when I enter a room. My reflection in mirrors sometimes lags a half-second behind my movements, and occasionally, when I'm very still and the world around me quiets, I feel it again. That subtle vibration, like wheels on distant tracks coming steadily closer. Story 10. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as carelessness. The second time, I blamed the wind. By the third morning, when I found the living room window wide open, the October air filling my new apartment with a bone-deep chill, I knew something was wrong. The brass latch that I'd secured the night before was now unlocked. The heavy frame swung outward as if inviting something in, or perhaps letting something out. I stood frozen before it, watching my breath form clouds in the frigid air as an inexplicable dread crept up my spine. The rational part of my mind desperately searched for explanations, but deep down, in that primal place where instinct overrides reason, I already knew. This window was never supposed to open. The real estate agent had called it a steal when she showed me the apartment 3 weeks ago. A spacious one-bedroom in a converted industrial building from the 1920s, with exposed brick walls, tall ceilings, and oversized windows. I'd signed the lease immediately, eager to leave behind my cramped studio and the memories of a relationship that had dissolved after 5 years. A fresh start, a new chapter. All those cliches we tell ourselves when trying to outrun the past. The building manager, a gaunt man with perpetually moist hands, had explained that the previous tenant had left abruptly. When I asked why, he'd glanced at the large living room window that overlooked an alleyway and simply said that city living wasn't for everyone. I should have recognized the evasion for what it was, but I was too captivated by the apartment's character and the allure of its below-market rent. The first few nights passed without incident. I unpacked methodically, arranging my sparse possessions in ways that made the space feel deliberately minimalist rather than empty. I established a routine, finding comfort in its predictability. Coffee at the kitchen island each morning, work at the makeshift desk in the corner, a glass of bourbon before bed. The apartment creaked and settled at night, but I attributed these sounds to the building's age and architectural quirks. On the fourth morning, as I padded barefoot from bedroom to kitchen, I noticed a peculiar draft. The living room window was open about 3 inches, despite my certainty that I'd closed it the night before. I shut it firmly, checking twice that the latch was secured, and attributed the incident to fatigue. Perhaps I'd been more exhausted than I'd realized, but the next morning, the same window was open again, wider this time. A fine layer of dust had collected on the sill, disturbed by small, irregular marks that resembled fingertips. My heart rate quickened as I examined the latch. It was intact, showing no signs of tampering. I closed the window, locked it, and stood staring at it for several minutes, trying to understand how it could have opened on its own. That evening, I tested the window. I closed it firmly, locked the latch, and then tried to push it open from both inside and outside. It remained securely shut. Satisfied, I took a step back and studied the weathered frame. Perhaps there was a structural issue causing it to unlock on its own. I decided to mention it to the building manager in the morning. When I approached him the next day, his reaction was unsettling. His perpetually damp palms rubbed against his pants as a nervous tic emerged at the corner of his left eye. He asked if I'd experienced anything else unusual, his voice carefully controlled, but betraying a tremor of concern. When I said no, his shoulders relaxed slightly, and he promised to send someone to check the window. No one ever came. That night, I reinforced the window with duct tape, pressing the adhesive firmly along the seams where the frame met the wall. Then I placed a small desk bell on the sill, positioned so that any movement would cause it to ring. Satisfied with this improvised alarm system, I went to bed, though sleep came fitfully. The sharp, jarring ring of the bell jolted me awake at 3:30 a.m. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay perfectly still, straining to hear any additional sounds. The apartment was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and my own shallow breathing. After several minutes of listening to nothing, I convinced myself that the bell had been knocked over by a draft or perhaps a mouse. I pulled the covers tighter and eventually drifted back to sleep. Morning revealed a different story. The window was not just open, it was fully ajar, the duct tape torn as though by force. The bell lay on the floor several feet from where I'd placed it, and on the sill, clearly visible in the gray morning light, was a series of smudges that looked like handprints, too large to be my own. My stomach clenched with a cold, sick fear as I slammed the window shut. I checked the locks on my front door and inspected the entire apartment, finding nothing out of place except for those handprints and the violated window. I took photographs of the marks with my phone, though I wasn't sure what I intended to do with them. Show the building manager? Call the police? What would I say? That my window was opening itself at night? That invisible hands were leaving prints on my sill? I could imagine their dismissive responses. Instead, I decided to set up a surveillance system. I positioned my laptop on a bookshelf opposite the window, installed a motion-activated recording app, and angled the webcam for an unobstructed view. Whatever was happening, I would have evidence. That day at work, I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept returning to the apartment, to the window, to what might be waiting for me when I returned. I left early, stopping at a hardware store to purchase a heavy-duty chain lock, which I installed across the window frame as soon as I got home. The metal links were thick and sturdy, secured with a padlock that required a key. I tested it multiple times, satisfied that nothing short of a bolt cutter could breach this barrier. I checked the laptop's position, ensuring the webcam had a clear view of the window, and activated the recording app. Then I retreated to my bedroom, double-checking the locks on my door before crawling into bed. Sleep evaded me as I lay rigid beneath the covers, ears straining for the sound of chains rattling or glass breaking. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally pulled me under. My alarm woke me at 7 a.m., and I immediately rushed to the living room, dread pooling in my stomach. The chain lock was still in place, the window firmly shut. Relief flooded through me as I approached the laptop to check the footage. Perhaps the previous incidents had been products of my imagination, manifestations of the stress of moving and the aftermath of my breakup. The video recording showed an uneventful night. The window remained closed, the chain unmoved. Hours passed in digital silence until the timestamp reached 3:33 a.m. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as I watched the metal chain begin to vibrate, though no one was touching it. The padlock clicked open on its own, falling to the floor with a thud that the microphone barely registered. Then, slowly, the brass latch on the window turned as if manipulated by invisible fingers. My throat constricted as the window began to open, the chain now hanging loose and useless. As the gap widened, a darkness deeper than the night outside seemed to gather in the opening. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a presence, a density that didn't belong in our world, and within that darkness, I could discern a shape, a silhouette that was approximately human, but wrong in subtle, nauseating ways, like a reflection in a warped mirror. The figure remained motionless outside the window for several minutes, facing into my apartment. Though it had no discernible features, no eyes that I could see, I felt its attention focused on me, on the camera, as if it knew it was being recorded. Then, with a fluid movement that defied natural physics, it reached a limb through the opening. The appendage was shadow-given form, elongated and jointed in impossible places. It extended across the room, toward the camera, growing impossibly long. The video ended abruptly. The file had corrupted at that exact moment, leaving me with nothing but those horrifying seconds of footage, and the knowledge that something had been in my apartment while I slept. My hands trembled as I shut the laptop. A cold sweat had broken out across my body, and I found it difficult to breathe. The rational part of my mind struggled to process what I'd seen, to find some explanation that didn't involve the supernatural. A prank? A technical glitch? A hallucination born from stress and lack of sleep? I messaged my boss that I was taking a sick day, then called the building manager. When he didn't answer, I left a terse message saying there was an emergency with my apartment. Then I searched online for any information about the building's history, looking for incidents or accidents that might explain what was happening. The search yielded results I wasn't prepared for. 3 years ago, a man had fallen to his death from the 3rd floor of the building, my floor. The article didn't specify which apartment, but it mentioned that the body was found in the alleyway below a window that had been mysteriously open, despite witness statements that the man was terrified of heights and always kept his windows locked. Further digging revealed that 2 previous tenants of the building had been treated for acute psychological distress. both reporting feelings of being watched and strange phenomena involving windows. One had developed severe insomnia and was eventually institutionalized after attempting to seal all openings in his apartment with concrete. The building manager finally returned my call in the late afternoon. When I confronted him with what I'd found online, his response was not denial, but resignation. He admitted that there had been incidents involving my specific apartment. The previous tenant had fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind most of his possessions. The tenant before that had broken her lease after just 2 months. Nobody stayed long. When I asked him directly what was happening, he hesitated before responding that some spaces retain impressions of past events. Some traumas echo. He wouldn't elaborate further, but offered to release me from my lease without penalty if I wanted to move out. I should have accepted his offer immediately. Instead, driven by a combination of curiosity, skepticism, and the stubborn belief that there had to be a rational explanation, I decided to stay one more night. I would set up multiple cameras this time, covering every angle of the window. I would remain awake, witnessing whatever happened with my own eyes. As dusk settled over the city, I fortified my position. I moved a heavy bookshelf in front of the window, wedging it firmly against the frame. I set up my laptop, phone, and a digital camera I'd borrowed from a friend, each recording from a different vantage point. I made a pot of strong coffee and settled into an armchair facing the window, a baseball bat resting across my knees. Hours passed without incident. Midnight came and went. The streets outside grew quiet as the city slept. By 3:00 a.m., my eyelids were heavy despite the caffeine coursing through my system. I got up to make another cup of coffee, and as I stood in the kitchen waiting for the water to boil, I heard it. The soft scrape of wood against wood. I returned to the living room to find the bookshelf moving slowly away from the window, as if pushed by gentle but persistent hands. The heavy furniture slid across the hardwood floor without any visible force acting upon it, the books trembling, but remaining in place. I stood paralyzed, the baseball bat forgotten at my feet, as the window's brass latch turned on its own with a soft click. The window swung open, allowing the cold night air to rush into the apartment. And there, hovering outside, was the shadow figure from the video. In person, it was more substantial than it had appeared on screen, a void in the shape of a man, but with proportions that seemed to shift and flow. Where its face should have been was only darkness, yet I could feel its attention fixed on me with terrible intensity. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we regarded each other. Then it began to move toward the open window, its form undulating like smoke, but with purpose. My paralysis broke, and I lunged for the baseball bat, swinging it wildly at the window. The glass shattered, fragments raining down onto the alleyway below. The noise was thunderous in the quiet night, but the shadow remained unaffected, continuing its inexorable approach. In desperation, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight function, aiming the beam directly at the figure. The effect was immediate and startling. The shadow recoiled as if in pain, its edges hissing and dissolving where the light touched it. I advanced, maintaining the beam on the retreating form, driving it back through the broken window until it dissipated entirely, leaving nothing but the empty night beyond the shattered glass. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat with my back against the wall opposite the window, the phone's flashlight still activated, illuminating the jagged remains of glass in the frame. When dawn finally broke, I packed a bag with essential items and left the apartment, pausing only to slip my key under the building manager's door. I'm writing this from a motel 20 miles away, where I've been reviewing the footage from last night. The laptop video shows the bookshelf moving and the window opening, but where I saw the shadow figure, the recording shows only darkness. The phone video is corrupted, and the digital camera's memory card is completely wiped. The only evidence I have is a single frame from the laptop recording, captured at exactly 3:33 a.m., showing what might be the edge of a silhouette at the window. It's not much, but it's enough to ensure I never return to that apartment. I don't know what was trying to enter my living space each night, or why it was fixated on that particular window. Was it drawn to the residual energy of past trauma, as the building manager implied? Was it somehow connected to the man who fell to his death? Or was it something older, something that had been there long before the building was constructed, waiting for its opportunity to cross the threshold between its world and ours? What I do know is that some boundaries aren't meant to be breached. Some windows should remain permanently closed, and some apartments, no matter how appealing the rent, conceal histories that make them uninhabitable to the living. The motel where I'm staying has windows that don't open. I've checked them 3 times, but sometimes in the darkest hours of the night, I think I see the latch trembling, and I wonder if, having found me once, it can find me again. Story 11. The old floorboards announced his presence before I ever saw him. 3:15 in the morning, like clockwork. That slow, methodical creak outside my door. In the decaying grandeur of the Harborview Hotel, sounds carried differently at night, transformed by darkness into something sinister. I knew he was there again tonight, waiting. I could feel his presence seeping through the thin wooden door of my room, a cold current of air that made the hair on my neck stand rigid. Sleep had become my enemy since checking into this place 5 days ago. The coastal town of Port Haven had seemed like the perfect retreat to finish my novel. Remote, quiet, trapped in time. The Harborview, with its peeling wallpaper and musty corridors, offered the isolation I craved at a price I could afford. Now I understood why. It started on my second night. A persistent creak pulled me from uneasy sleep, the sound so deliberate it couldn't be dismissed as the natural settling of an old building. My writer's curiosity overcame my initial apprehension. I slipped from bed, my bare feet flinching against the cold wooden floor, and approached the door. The brass knob felt unnaturally cold against my palm as I turned it slightly, creating just enough space to peer through the crack. That was when I first saw him. A man stood precisely 15 feet down the corridor, shoulder pressed against the faded floral wallpaper. The dim emergency lights cast long shadows across his gaunt face. He wore an outdated gray suit that hung loosely on his frame. His posture suggested patience, head slightly tilted, hands clasped before him, feet planted firmly as if he'd been standing there for hours, for days, for years, perhaps. I retreated into my room, convincing myself he was another guest with insomnia or strange habits. The Harborview seemed the type of place that attracted peculiar individuals. I returned to bed, but sleep remained elusive, my mind fixated on his stillness, on the unnatural patience in his stance. The next morning, I casually inquired at the front desk about other guests on my floor. Ms. Winters, the elderly receptionist whose skin seemed as weathered and gray as the hotel itself, peered at me over horn-rimmed glasses. Her arthritic fingers stopped shuffling papers. She informed me that I was currently the only guest on the 3rd floor. When I described the man, something flickered behind her rheumy eyes. Recognition, perhaps fear, before she quickly dismissed my concerns. "Old hotels have odd characters," she said. "Probably a guest from another floor who got lost." Her explanation made sense, yet her eyes told a different story. That night, I awoke again at precisely 3:15 a.m. The familiar creaking had returned. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reluctantly approached the door. Through the narrow gap, I saw him again. Same position, same vacant stare directed at nothing in particular, same unsettling stillness. Only tonight he stood 5 feet closer to my door. My breath caught in my throat. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead as I watched him. Then, as if sensing my observation, his head rotated slowly toward my door. I jerked back, stumbling away from the crack. My back collided with the bed frame, sending pain shooting up my spine. I remained frozen, listening for any sound indicating movement. Nothing came except the pounding of blood in my ears and my own shallow breathing. I didn't check again that night. I wedged a chair under the doorknob and huddled in bed until morning light filtered through the threadbare curtains. By my 4th night at the Harborview, I had established a pattern of investigating, each time finding him closer to my door. 10 feet away, then 5. My sleep deteriorated further. Dark circles formed under my eyes. My hands developed a persistent tremor. My novel remained untouched, the cursor blinking accusingly on a blank digital page. I considered changing rooms or finding another hotel, but something inexplicable kept me rooted in place. A morbid fascination, perhaps, or some deeper connection I couldn't yet understand. I began researching the hotel's history during daylight hours, combing through local archives and questioning longtime residents. The barkeeper at the weathered tavern across the street grew uncomfortable when I mentioned the harbor view. He wiped the same spot on the counter repeatedly while explaining that the hotel had its share of stories. Most concerning was the tale of Thomas Marsh, a traveling salesman who checked into room 312 in 1967 and never officially checked out. According to local legend, Marsh waited every night for his lover to join him, but she never came. Some said she had died in a car accident on her way to meet him. Others claimed she had chosen another man. After weeks of waiting, Marsh simply vanished. The barkeeper wouldn't elaborate further, suggesting only that I might consider alternative accommodations. I noted with growing unease that I occupied room 311, directly adjacent to Marsh's. That night, I fortified my door with the room's desk and dresser. My rational mind recognized the futility of these barricades against what might be a supernatural entity, but the primitive part of my brain demanded action, protection, no matter how symbolic. I sat on the edge of the bed, notepad in hand, documenting my experiences and theories. My handwriting had grown increasingly erratic, mirroring my psychological state. 3:15 a.m. The familiar creaking returned, followed by a new sound, a soft, deliberate knock, 3 measured taps against my door. My mouth went dry, my lungs seemed to malfunction. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I stared at the barricaded door, watching with horror as the dresser scraped forward half an inch across the floor under some invisible pressure. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Who are you?" I finally managed to call out, my voice cracking with fear. "What do you want?" No response came, only the oppressive silence of the hotel. The dresser pushed forward another inch. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for connection to the outside world, but the screen showed no signal, a common occurrence in this remote coastal town with its unreliable service. The digital clock on the nightstand flickered, numbers distorting before settling again on 3:15. Time itself seemed suspended. The pressure against my barricade ceased. Long minutes passed as I sat paralyzed, ears straining for any sound. Eventually, I convinced myself to approach the door. With trembling hands, I moved the furniture aside just enough to peer through the crack once more. The corridor stood empty. Relief flooded through me, leaving my limbs weak and rubbery. Then my eyes dropped to the floor, where a small rectangular object lay directly outside my door, a yellowed business card. I retrieved it quickly, slamming and re-barricading the door. Under the harsh light of the bedside lamp, I examined the card. "Thomas Marsh, pharmaceutical representative," it read, followed by a phone number with an obsolete area code. The reverse side bore a handwritten note. "She's not coming, but you might be what I've been waiting for." My hands shook so violently that the card fluttered to the floor. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in the bathtub, as far from the door as the room's configuration allowed. The following morning, I approached Ms. Winters with the business card, demanding explanations. Her reaction confirmed my worst fears. She recognized the card immediately, her face draining of color. She admitted that Thomas Marsh's disappearance remained the hotel's unsolved mystery. Staff had cleared his room after weeks of absence, finding nothing except his unpacked suitcase and dozens of identical business cards arranged in concentric circles on the floor. I insisted on seeing room 312. After initial reluctance, Ms. Winters acquiesced, retrieving an ancient key from a drawer that appeared rarely opened. Room 312 presented a disturbing tableau. Unlike the other updated rooms, this one remained suspended in the late 1960s. Same furniture, same wallpaper, same heavy curtains. A fine layer of dust covered every surface despite Ms. Winters' insistence that the room was regularly cleaned. The air felt dense, resistant, as if the room existed in its own pocket of time. Most unsettling was the suitcase on the luggage rack, latches open, contents partially visible. Neatly folded shirts, a shaving kit, a pair of polished shoes that matched the description of those worn by my nocturnal visitor. Ms. Winters refused to enter, standing rigidly at the threshold. When I turned back to question her further, I noticed she was staring not at the room but at me, with an expression of profound pity. "He finds someone every few years," she said softly. "Always writers or artists, always alone, always in room 311. She wouldn't elaborate further, hurrying away down the corridor with surprising agility for her age. That night, my final night at the Harborview, I made no attempts to barricade the door. Instead, I sat waiting in the armchair facing the entrance, Marsh's business card in one hand, my notebook in the other. My earlier terror had transformed into something else, a resignation perhaps, or a determination to confront whatever awaited me. 3:15. Am arrived with the familiar creaking. I rose on unsteady legs and approached the door without hesitation. Through the crack, I saw him standing directly outside, his gaunt face inches from the wood. His eyes, gray and depthless, stared directly into mine. I understood then what I needed to do. With trembling fingers, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. The corridor stretched empty before me. No sign of Thomas Marsh or anyone else. A cool breeze carried the scent of salt water despite the absence of open windows. I stepped into the hallway drawn toward room 312. Its door stood slightly ajar, soft light spilling onto the worn carpet. Something compelled me forward, not fear anymore, but a strange sense of inevitability. As I approached Marsh's room, I felt a pressure building in my ears, the air becoming thick and difficult to navigate. The door swung wider without being touched. Inside, the room had transformed. No longer dusty and abandoned, it appeared lived in and contemporary. The suitcase lay open with modern clothing visible inside. A laptop, my laptop, sat on the desk beside a stack of handwritten pages. My unfinished novel. On the bed lay a business card. I picked it up, already knowing what I would find. It bore my name, my profession, my contact information. On the reverse, "I've been waiting for you to take my place." The door closed softly behind me. In the corridor, floorboards creaked under slow, methodical footsteps moving away from room 312. Away from what was now my room. Through the crack in the door, I watched myself walk away. I understood then why Ms. Winters had looked at me with such pity. I wasn't Marsh's target. I was his replacement. I would now be the man in the corridor waiting night after night for someone to take my place. A writer, an artist, someone alone. My fingers traced the yellowed business card from 1967, now transmuted with my own information. Somewhere in the hotel, the elevator hummed. A new guest was arriving. I heard Ms. Winters greeting them, her voice carrying through the ancient ventilation system. "Room 311 is all prepared for you," she said. "Perfect for a writer seeking isolation." I straightened my tie and prepared for my long wait in the corridor. After all, I now had all the time in the world. Story 12. The moment we stepped beyond the threshold where sunlight failed to reach, I felt it. A cold current of air that didn't belong. Not the natural draft that occasionally flows through cave systems, but something rhythmic, something measured, something that felt disturbingly like breath against the back of my neck. Mike hadn't noticed yet, his headlamp beam dancing ahead as he excitedly pointed out limestone formations. But I knew immediately we had made a terrible mistake entering this place. Some doors in this world aren't meant to be opened, and some passages should remain unexplored. I just wish I had listened to that initial instinct before we ventured deeper into the darkness. The Sawyer Caverns expedition was supposed to be a weekend adventure, nothing more. Mike and I had been exploring caves throughout the Appalachians for nearly 7 years, and this newly discovered system was relatively small according to the Geological Survey. Perfect for a quick 2-day trip before returning to our mundane office jobs on Monday. The local guides had mapped most of it, though they mentioned a few narrow passages they hadn't fully explored due to time constraints. That should have been our first warning. We arrived early Friday, our packs loaded with the usual gear: helmets, headlamps, backup lights, water, protein bars, first aid kit, climbing rope, and our cameras. The entrance was unassuming, a jagged crack in a hillside partially obscured by vegetation that required some careful maneuvering to access. According to our maps, the main chamber opened up about 50 feet in, with 3 primary passages branching outward. The plan was to explore the eastern passage today, camp in the main chamber, and tackle the northern and western routes tomorrow. The eastern passage initially matched our expectations. We photographed impressive stalactites, documented a small underground stream, and even spotted some cave crickets that Mike insisted on photographing from multiple angles. Standard stuff. It wasn't until we reached a tight squeeze about 2 hours in that everything changed. The squeeze was narrow, but manageable, a vertical crack that required turning sideways and shuffling through about 15 feet of compressed space. Mike went first, his slimmer frame making it look easier than it would be for me. I followed, inhaling deeply to compress my chest as I edged through the narrow gap. That's when I first felt it against my face, a gentle but persistent flow of cold air. "Feel that draft?" I called out to Mike as I emerged on the other side, brushing limestone dust from my jacket. He nodded, checking his compass. "Yeah, good sign though. Means there's probably another entrance or at least a larger chamber ahead." But something felt wrong. The air didn't flow steadily like a natural draft. It pulsed, subtle but unmistakable, like inhalation and exhalation. "It's coming from deeper in," I said, pointing my light toward a downward sloping tunnel ahead of us. "But the main exit is behind us." Mike shrugged, already moving toward the descending passage. "Probably connects to another system. This whole mountain could be hollow for all we know." I hesitated, playing my light across the chamber walls. The beam caught something unusual, what looked like faint markings etched into the stone. Moving closer, I traced my fingers over a series of strange symbols carved into the rock face. They weren't natural formations. They had clearly been carved by tools, yet they resembled no language I recognized. "Mike, check this out." I ran my hand over the markings. "These are man-made." He joined me, his expression shifting from excitement to puzzlement. "Weird. They don't look like any Native American symbols I've seen." He snapped a few photos. "Maybe early settlers, or some kind of modern graffiti." I shook my head. "They look old. Really old." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cave's natural temperature. "And they're all over this section." As we continued examining the walls, I noticed the carvings became more concentrated around the descending passage. The cold air continued flowing from that direction, but now I detected something else, a subtle sound riding the current. At first I thought it was just the normal acoustics of the cave amplifying our movements, but as I strained to listen, it began to sound disturbingly like whispers. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice dropping involuntarily to a whisper itself. Mike tilted his head, listening. "Just the water dripping back near the entrance." "No, it's something else." I moved toward the descending passage, drawn despite my growing unease. "It sounds like, voices." Mike looked at me skeptically but followed as I started down the slope. The passage descended at a steep angle, requiring careful footing on the slick limestone. Our lights revealed a larger chamber opening up below, and the pulsing air grew noticeably stronger as we approached. The whispers grew louder too, though still indistinct. A susurration of sounds that almost formed words but remained just beyond comprehension. The chamber we entered was vast, its ceiling lost in darkness beyond the reach of our lights. Stalactites hung like massive stone teeth, and a series of natural limestone columns created the unsettling impression of ribs enclosing the space. The floor descended toward a central depression where a small pool of perfectly still water reflected our lights like a black mirror. And the air now moved in unmistakable rhythm, powerful enough to create small ripples across the water's surface with each pulse. In, out, in, out. The timing perfectly matching the cadence of human breath. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. The sound of my pulse throbbed in my ears, nearly drowning out the whispers that now seemed to emanate from the very walls around us. Mike was saying something, pointing excitedly at the unusual formations, but his voice seemed distant, overwhelmed by the breathing of the cave and the sibilant almost words carried on each exhalation. I knelt by the pool, trying to steady my increasingly shaky hands. The water was unnaturally cold, so cold it burned when I dipped my fingers into it. As I withdrew my hand, I noticed more symbols carved into the stone rim surrounding the pool, more elaborate than those we'd seen above. And for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought I understood what they said. The meaning hovered at the edge of comprehension before slipping away, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. Mike suggested we continue exploring the chamber's perimeter, his voice betraying no sign that he felt the wrongness permeating this place. I reluctantly agreed, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. We separated slightly, each following the curved wall in opposite directions, planning to meet on the far side. As I moved deeper, the whispers intensified. My headlamp began to flicker erratically, the beam weakening despite the fresh batteries we'd installed that morning. The shadows seemed to move independently of my light, contracting and expanding with the breathing rhythm of the cave. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead and trickled down my spine. My mouth went dry. I tried calling out to Mike, but my voice emerged as a hoarse croak that the darkness swallowed instantly. I turned to look back toward the center of the chamber, trying to locate Mike's light. For a moment I couldn't see him at all, and panic clawed at my throat. Then I caught a glimpse of his beam, weakened like mine but visible, moving along the far wall. Relief flooded through me until I noticed something else. A shadow moving between us, keeping pace with him but separate from his form. It was too tall, too thin, its proportions all wrong for a human silhouette. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks in the unreliable light. When I looked again, the shadow was gone, but the whispers had changed, becoming more urgent, more insistent. And now, to my horror, I began to understand fragments of what they were saying. Trapped, long, hungry, release. My legs nearly buckled beneath me. These weren't words carried on the air. They were forming directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, trying to ground myself in something solid and real. My fingers encountered more carvings, and I jerked my hand away as though burned. The symbols seemed to writhe under my touch, rearranging themselves when viewed from the corner of my eye. I called out to Mike again, louder this time, my voice cracking with strain. He responded from across the chamber, asking if I was okay. I wasn't. Not remotely. But I managed to suggest we regroup at the entrance to this chamber. Something in my tone must have communicated my distress because he agreed immediately. As I made my way back toward the entrance, the cave's breathing intensified. The air now rushed past me with enough force to ruffle my hair and clothing. The temperature plummeted further, and my breath clouded densely before me. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, a cacophony of alien syllables that somehow conveyed terrible hunger and ancient rage. Release, body, need, give. I broke into a stumbling run, my light bouncing wildly across the uneven floor. My foot caught on a rock, sending me sprawling painfully onto the stone. My headlamp struck the ground and went out, plunging me into absolute darkness. Panic exploded in my chest. I scrambled blindly, fumbling for my backup light, my fingers numb and clumsy with fear. In that moment of complete darkness, I sensed movement all around me, a shifting of the air that suggested forms moving closer. The cave's breath washed over me, carrying with it the stench of age and decay. Something cold and insubstantial brushed against my face, like fingers made of mist. My backup light finally flared to life in my shaking hands, revealing nothing but empty space around me. But the feeling of presence remained, as though the darkness itself had become sentient and retreated just beyond the boundary of my light. I spotted Mike approaching from the other side of the chamber, his expression tight with concern. As he reached me, he gripped my shoulder, asking what had happened. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a disjointed mess. The whispers, the shadow, the symbols rearranging themselves. Even to my own ears, I sounded unhinged. Mike's concern deepened, but I could see he didn't believe me. He suggested fatigue or possibly mild carbon dioxide poisoning, which can cause hallucinations in poorly ventilated caves. A rational explanation. A comforting one. I wanted desperately to believe it. But then his light swept across the pool at the center of the chamber, and we both froze. The previously still surface now rippled violently, though nothing had disturbed it. The ripples formed patterns that mirrored the symbols carved into the stone. "That's not normal," Mike whispered, his skepticism finally giving way to unease. The breathing of the cave had synchronized with the water's movement, inhaling as the ripples receded toward the center, exhaling as they expanded outward. And with each pulse, the whispers grew louder, more coherent. Need vessel. 2 vessels. Perfect. My skin crawled with revulsion as I understood what the cave wanted, what the entity breathing through the stone desired. It had been trapped here, carved into imprisonment by those symbols, for how long I couldn't imagine. And now it had found what it needed to escape. Us. I grabbed Mike's arm, pulling him toward the passage that had brought us here. For once, he didn't resist or question. Something in my face, or perhaps the increasingly violent movement of the water, had finally convinced him of the danger. We scrambled up the sloping passage, our lights bobbing wildly, casting monstrous shadows that seemed to reach for us with elongated fingers. The cave's breath became a howling wind behind us, driving us forward with hurricane force. The whispers rose to screams of rage and frustration that scraped against the inside of my skull like rusted metal. Stalactites vibrated above us, and small stones rained down as the entire passageway shuddered. We reached the squeeze, but now the narrow crack seemed to be contracting, the edges grinding slowly toward each other like a stone jaw closing. Mike went through first, his slimmer frame barely making it as the opening continued to narrow. I followed, sucking in my breath, feeling the rock scrape painfully against my chest and back as I forced myself through the shrinking gap. For one terrible moment, I thought I wouldn't make it. The stone pressed against me from both sides, holding me immobile as the entity's screams reached a deafening crescendo in my mind. Something cold and insubstantial wrapped around my ankles, tugging me backward. I kicked wildly, pushing forward with every ounce of strength I possessed. Mike grabbed my outstretched hands from the other side, pulling desperately. With a final surge of effort, I broke free, tumbling through the gap just as it sealed behind me with a sound like massive millstones grinding together. We didn't stop. We ran through the eastern passage, abandoning equipment in our haste, guided only by our fading lights and desperate instinct. The cave's breath pursued us, growing weaker with distance but never quite disappearing. The whispers faded too, but fragments continued to form in my mind, growing fainter but still audible. Find another way. We'll find you. Remember. We emerged from the cave entrance as twilight was falling, collapsing onto the ground outside, gulping the fresh air like drowning men. Neither of us spoke for a long time. What could we possibly say that wouldn't sound like madness? That was 3 weeks ago. We reported a cave-in to the local authorities, warning them that the Sawyer Cavern system was unstable and dangerous. They've since sealed the entrance as a safety precaution. Mike has convinced himself that we experienced oxygen deprivation or encountered pockets of hallucinogenic gases, scientific explanations that let him sleep at night. I wish I could believe the same, but every night since our escape, I dream of those symbols. In my sleep, I understand what they mean, what they were designed to contain. And worse, I feel the entity's breath against my face, carrying those terrible whispers. Found another way. Coming for vessel. Soon. Sometimes I wake to find my bedroom unnaturally cold, with a faint rhythmic current of air that has no source. And on my bathroom mirror, drawn in the condensation, I occasionally glimpse symbols like those carved into the cave walls, gone when I look directly at them, but visible from the corner of my eye. Most disturbing of all is what happened yesterday. While shaving, I noticed something strange about my reflection, a momentary distortion, as though something was moving beneath my skin. And for just an instant, my eyes in the mirror weren't my own. They were ancient, cold, and hungry. I don't think we escaped that cave at all. I think we brought something back with us, and it's still breathing. Story 13. The first scratch came at 3:17 a.m. A faint, distant sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. I jolted awake, my heart already hammering against my ribs before my mind had fully surfaced from sleep. In the darkness of my bedroom, the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I told myself it was just the old pipes in the walls, or perhaps a rodent that had found its way into the building's ancient infrastructure. After all, that's why I'd started the renovations in the first place. This pre-war apartment building on the edge of Boston's South End had character, but also the many problems that came with a century of existence. I settled back into bed, pulling the covers tight around my shoulders despite the unusual warmth of the October night. Sleep refused to return. Something about that sound had wormed its way into my consciousness, leaving me alert and uneasy. As I stared at the ceiling, watching the faint patterns of light from passing cars trace ghostly fingers across the plaster, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my apartment, as if the dimensions of the rooms had subtly changed while I slept. The discovery came 3 days later. I was supervising the demolition of the non-load-bearing wall between my kitchen and what had been a small breakfast nook. The contractor, a burly man named Ramirez, had just taken a sledgehammer to the drywall when his expression changed. He stepped back, wiping dust from his brow, and gestured for me to take a look. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice betraying an uncertainty I hadn't heard from him before. "You might want to see this." Where the drywall had fallen away, another surface was revealed, not the expected wooden framing or insulation, but a door. A simple wooden door with a tarnished brass knob, painted the same faded yellow as the exposed lath behind the demolished sections of wall. It made no sense. According to the building plans I'd studied meticulously before purchasing the apartment, there was nothing but a solid exterior wall and a 12-story drop behind that section of kitchen. I reached past Ramirez and placed my palm against the door's surface. It felt unnaturally cold, as if it had been refrigerated. When I wrapped my fingers around the knob, a violent shiver ran up my arm and blossomed across my shoulders. The metal felt almost wet, though when I pulled my hand back, my palm was dry. Ramirez was watching me, his dark eyes wary. I asked him if he had ever encountered anything like this in his renovation work. His response was quick. Too quick. He said old buildings had all sorts of oddities, hidden spaces created during Prohibition, servant passages long forgotten. But his eyes never met mine as he spoke, and I noticed him making a small gesture with his right hand, something that looked suspiciously like crossing himself. I dismissed Ramirez and his crew early that day, claiming I had a migraine coming on. The truth was that I wanted to be alone with my discovery. As their footsteps and voices receded down the hallway, I felt the apartment grow larger around me, the silence expanding until it seemed to press against my eardrums. The door opened with surprising ease, swinging inward without a sound. No creaking hinges, no dramatic resistance. Just a smooth, silent motion that somehow felt more unsettling than any horror movie cliché. The air that escaped from the revealed space carried a scent I couldn't immediately identify. Musty and organic, like wet soil and something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand rigid. I fumbled for my phone and activated its flashlight. The beam revealed a space approximately 6 feet square. No windows, no outlets, no light fixtures. Just bare walls covered in what appeared to be writing. Thousands upon thousands of marks scratched into the plaster. Some looked like words in a language I couldn't recognize. Others were just frantic, chaotic scratchings, as if made by someone, or something, desperate to get out. The floor was bare wood, worn smooth in the center but deeply scored around the edges with long parallel grooves. My mind immediately conjured the image of fingernails clawing frantically, and I felt my stomach lurch. In the corner lay a small object that, when I cautiously approached and directed my light at it, turned out to be a pocket watch. Tarnished silver, its face cracked, its hands frozen at 3:17. The room was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The angles seemed slightly off, as if the corners weren't quite 90 degrees. Standing inside, I felt a pressure in my sinuses, like the sensation of being deep underwater. My breathing grew shallow and quick, and sweat began to bead along my hairline despite the noticeable chill. I backed out quickly, pulling the door firmly shut behind me. With shaking hands, I took out a pen and notebook and sketched the location of the door. Then I pulled out the official floor plans I'd received when purchasing the apartment and compared them. According to the documents, I was staring at a solid exterior wall. The room I just stood in simply didn't exist. That night, the scratching returned. Louder this time, more insistent. No longer distant, it seemed to come from directly behind my bedroom wall. I lay rigid in bed, my sheets soaked with sweat, listening as the sound traveled slowly across the wall, then up toward the ceiling, then back down again. It moved with purpose, as if searching. By morning, I had convinced myself that I was dealing with a severe raccoon or rat infestation, something that explained both the hidden space, a forgotten maintenance access perhaps, and the scratching. I called an exterminator who came that afternoon. He was thorough, checking every inch of the apartment, including the space behind the mysterious door, which now contained nothing but dust and cobwebs. No marks on the walls, no grooves in the floor, no pocket watch. The exterminator found no signs of rodents, no entry points, nothing to explain the sounds I'd been hearing. As he was leaving, I casually mentioned the hidden room. His reaction was puzzling. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, quickly masked by professional neutrality. He asked which building I was in, and when I told him, he nodded as if confirming something to himself. Before departing, he suggested, in a carefully neutral tone that nonetheless conveyed urgency, that I might want to reconsider my renovation plans. Perhaps the apartment was fine as it was. I spent the next day at the city records office, digging through the building's history. The structure had been built in 1908 as a luxury apartment building. Over the decades, it had gone through periods of decline and renewal, but nothing in its history seemed unusual or ominous. No tragic fires, no notorious crimes, nothing that would explain the existence of a hidden room or the growing sense of dread that had taken up residence alongside me in apartment 11B. When I returned home that evening, exhausted and no wiser, I found that the door had moved. It was no longer in the kitchen wall. That section now showed only the expected wooden studs and insulation exposed by the demolition. Instead, I discovered the yellow door in my bedroom, occupying the space where my closet had been that morning. My breath caught in my throat as I approached it. The brass knob gleamed in the lamplight, looking freshly polished. I placed my palm against the wood, still cold, unnaturally so. My logical mind grasped for explanations. I was overworked, stressed about the renovation costs, perhaps even experiencing some sort of hallucinatory episode, but the solid feel of the doorknob in my hand refuted these rationalizations. This was real. Somehow, impossibly, the door had moved. I opened it slowly, my pulse throbbing visibly in my wrist. The room beyond was the same size as before, but everything else had changed. The walls were now covered in photographs, hundreds of them, overlapping, creating a disorienting collage. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see that they were all of the same subject: my apartment. Empty rooms photographed from various angles, spanning what looked like decades, based on the changing decor and the varying quality and age of the prints. And in each photo, barely visible in some corner or reflected in some surface, was a silhouette. A dark figure watching. In the photos from what appeared to be the 1970s, it lurked in the far corner of the living room. In the 1980s prints, it stood in the hallway. In the most recent photos, which showed my own furniture, my own possessions, it was closer to the camera, its featureless form more distinct. In the center of the room lay the pocket watch, now wound and ticking softly. Its hands pointed to 11:52. I slammed the door shut, my chest heaving as if I'd run miles. The sweat pouring down my face tasted metallic on my lips. I grabbed my keys and fled the apartment, spending the night in a hotel downtown. The contractor called the next morning to say his crew wouldn't be returning. He cited scheduling conflicts, but his voice held the same wariness I'd noticed before. When I pressed him, he hesitated, then said something that sent ice through my veins. "Some spaces aren't meant to be opened, Mr. Caldwell." I returned to the apartment that afternoon, armed with a digital camera to document the impossible room and its contents. I needed proof, for myself, for whatever authorities might help me make sense of this phenomenon. But the bedroom door had vanished, the closet restored to its original state. A methodical search revealed the yellow door had relocated again, this time replacing the entrance to my bathroom. My hand trembled as I turned the knob, not knowing what version of the room would greet me. This iteration was worse. The small space now contained a single chair facing the door. The walls were bare except for a mirror mounted directly opposite the entrance, but the reflection showed not the empty chair, but the chair occupied by me. My reflection sat motionless, staring forward, but its eyes were solid black, its skin gray and desiccated. As I stood frozen in the doorway, my reflection slowly raised one hand and pressed a finger to its lips. On the floor beside the chair lay the pocket watch. Its hands pointed to 6:43. I backed away, unable to tear my gaze from my seated doppelganger. As I pulled the door closed, I could have sworn I saw my reflection begin to stand. The following days became a nightmare of anticipation and discovery. Each time I returned to the apartment, the door had relocated. Each time I worked up the courage to open it, the room had transformed. In one incarnation, the floor was covered in thousands of tiny teeth, human teeth, yellowed and worn. In another, the walls wept a thick, clear fluid that smelled of vinegar and salt. The pocket watch remained the only constant, its hands marking a different time with each visitation, moving steadily toward midnight. I stopped going to work, stopped answering calls, spent hours sitting in my car in the parking garage, dreading the return to my apartment but unable to stay away. I began to notice subtle changes in the apartment's dimensions. Hallways that stretched slightly longer than they should. Ceilings that seemed incrementally higher. Windows that, when viewed from certain angles, showed not the Boston skyline but a gray, featureless void. Sleep became my enemy. Each time I drifted off, the scratching would begin. Closer now, sometimes directly beneath my bed. Twice I jolted awake to find the yellow door had appeared in a new location while I slept, once replacing the front door of the apartment, effectively trapping me inside until I gathered the courage to open it and step through the room to the hallway beyond. I consulted doctors who found nothing physically wrong with me. I spoke to a psychiatrist who prescribed medication that did nothing to stop the door's migrations or the room's transformations. I researched the building's history more deeply, interviewing longtime residents who smiled politely and ended our conversations quickly when I mentioned renovations or hidden spaces. Last night, the door replaced my bedroom wall, the entire wall, stretching from floor to ceiling, wider than any of its previous manifestations. I sat on the edge of my bed for hours, staring at its yellow surface, watching as the wood seemed to pulse slightly, as if breathing. When I finally opened it, the space beyond was no longer a small room. It was a vast cavernous chamber extending farther than my flashlight's beam could reach. The floor dropped away in a steep decline just beyond the threshold. From somewhere in the darkness came sounds, movement, whispers, the occasional chime of what might have been the pocket watch, amplified to cathedral bell proportions. And I understood then what was happening. The room wasn't in my apartment. My apartment was in the room. Whatever space lay beyond that yellow door was the true reality, and what I had thought was my life was merely a temporary pocket carved out of something older and vaster. As I stood in the doorway, vertigo washing over me in waves, I noticed writing on the wall beside the door, fresh writing, the plaster still damp where something had carved into it. It read simply, 11:59. I closed the door and wedged a chair under the knob, knowing even as I did so that it was futile. The door would simply appear elsewhere. There was no escaping it, no renovating it away, no pretending it didn't exist. So now I sit at my kitchen table, watching the minute hand on my wall clock approach midnight. The apartment is silent, the scratching sounds absent for the first time in weeks. I've packed a bag, clothes, toiletries, the essentials for whatever lies ahead. The yellow door currently occupies the wall beside the refrigerator, pulsing gently in time with my heartbeat. I know what I have to do. The door wants to be opened, the room wants to be entered, and whatever exists beyond that threshold wants to be acknowledged. My watch shows 11:59. 1 minute remains of what I've known as reality. 1 minute until I step through the yellow door for the final time, leaving behind this space that I now understand was never truly mine, was never truly real. The knob turns easily under my hand, the door swinging inward with that same unsettling silence. Beyond lies darkness and possibility, terror and truth. I take a deep breath, pick up my bag, and step forward. The door closes behind me with a sound like coming home. Story 14. The cold has a way of distorting reality. It bends light across ice crystals, creates mirages on frozen lakes, and plays tricks on a mind desperate for warmth. But what I witnessed in Patagonia wasn't a trick of the light or a hallucination born from isolation. The tracks in the snow, appearing from nowhere, leading into the dense forest but never returning, were as real as the cabin that now feels more like a prison than shelter. I know this because I followed them, and what I discovered has left me questioning not just my sanity, but the very nature of reality itself. I came to Patagonia seeking solitude. After 15 years working 80-hour weeks at a Manhattan investment firm, I needed distance from technology, from people, from the incessant demands of modern life. The cabin rental description promised profound isolation and reconnection with primal nature. What it didn't mention were the footprints, or the unsettling geometry of the place. The first 3 days passed uneventfully. I settled into a simple routine, hiking in the mornings, reading by the fire in the afternoons, and watching the spectacular sunset paint the mountains and glaciers in colors that seemed to exist nowhere else on Earth. The cabin itself was rustic but comfortable, a single room with a small kitchen area, a bathroom, a bed positioned against the west wall, and large windows offering views of the surrounding landscape. A wood stove provided ample heat against the bitter cold that descended each night. It was on the 4th night that I first noticed them. I had stepped outside to gather more firewood from the stack against the cabin's northern wall. The moon hung full and impossibly large in the night sky, casting everything in a pale blue light that made the snow-covered ground glow with an almost otherworldly luminescence. That's when I saw them, footprints in the fresh powder, appearing abruptly about 10 feet from the cabin's eastern side. Human footprints, average size, normal stride. They led in a straight line toward the forest's edge, about 50 yards away, and disappeared among the trees. I stood motionless, wood clutched against my chest, as my breath formed clouds in the frigid air. Something about those tracks triggered an instinctive unease. They appeared from nowhere, no tracks leading to that starting point, as if someone had materialized out of thin air and then walked away. And why would anyone be out here? The nearest town was over 30 miles away. I told myself there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps an animal had walked through earlier, and the wind had partially obscured the tracks, creating the illusion they started abruptly. Perhaps another hiker had wandered by while I was absorbed in my book. I gathered the wood and retreated inside, securing the door with both the lock and the heavy wooden bar I'd previously considered an old-fashioned quirk. Sleep came reluctantly that night, my mind cycling through increasingly implausible explanations for what I'd seen. When morning arrived, I rushed outside to examine the tracks in daylight, only to find them gone, erased by a light overnight snowfall. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined them, until I saw them again the next night, and the night after, and every night that followed. Always the same pattern, appearing from nowhere, leading into the forest, never returning. Sometimes they appeared closer to the cabin, sometimes farther away, but always on the eastern side, always heading in the same direction. I began documenting them, taking photos with my phone, measuring the distance from the cabin, noting the time they appeared. They materialized around midnight, regardless of whether I was awake or asleep, as if summoned by some nocturnal ritual. By the 9th night, fear had twisted into a different emotion, obsession. I needed to understand. The rational part of my brain still insisted there must be a logical explanation, but that voice was growing fainter. After a week of disturbed sleep and constant vigilance, I made my decision. I would follow the tracks. I prepared methodically. Dressed in my heaviest cold weather gear, headlamp secured, pocket knife in one pocket, flare gun in the other. I waited until midnight, watching through the window until the tracks appeared, materializing as if pressed into the snow by invisible feet. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped outside, my breath shallow and quick. The cold hit me like a physical blow, but I barely noticed it. My attention was fixed entirely on those tracks. I approached cautiously, studying them in the beam of my headlamp. They looked perfectly normal. The treaded pattern of heavy boots, about a size 10. The stride length suggested someone walking deliberately but unhurriedly. I took a deep breath and began following them toward the tree line. The forest at night was an entirely different world than the one I'd explored during my daytime hikes. The trees, ancient southern beeches, seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked even the generous moonlight. My headlamp carved a tunnel of visibility through the darkness, but anything beyond its narrow beam remained hidden. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my boots in the snow and my increasingly labored breathing. I followed the tracks for what felt like hours, but was probably no more than 40 minutes. They maintained their straight, purposeful line through the trees, never deviating, never hesitating. My own steps became mechanical, my mind detached from my body as if I were watching myself from above. A persistent sense of wrongness crept up my spine. Something about the forest's geometry felt off, as if the trees weren't quite where they should be, or perhaps weren't quite the shape trees ought to be. The cold intensified as I moved deeper into the forest. Not the natural cold of a Patagonian winter night, but something more penetrating, more deliberate. It seeped through my layers of clothing, crept into my lungs with each breath, and settled in my bones like an infection. My fingers grew numb despite my insulated gloves. My face stiffened until I could barely move my lips. Yet still I continued, drawn forward by an impulse I couldn't name. The tracks led me to a small clearing where they abruptly stopped. I swept my headlamp across the open space, confused. There was nothing here. No cabin, no structure, no other person, just an unremarkable circle of empty ground surrounded by trees. I turned in a slow circle, the beam of light cutting through darkness, revealing nothing but more trees, more darkness. I was about to retreat when I noticed something odd about the clearing's far edge. The trees there seemed to blur slightly, their outlines less defined than they should be. I approached cautiously, my legs heavy with exhaustion and cold. As I drew closer, the blur resolved into something impossible. A path continuing through the trees, but one that somehow bent at an angle that my mind couldn't properly process. It was as if the forest continued not forward, but somehow sideways, upward. The direction defied categorization in any spatial framework I understood. My rational mind rebelled. This couldn't exist. Yet there it was, a corridor through reality itself, revealed by the tracks that now continued along this impossible angle. My skin prickled with a sensation beyond fear, a primal recognition that I stood at the threshold of something fundamentally wrong. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed for retreat. Instead, I took a single step onto this new path. The world tilted. My inner ear screamed with sudden vertigo as my perception struggled to accommodate this new orientation. The trees around me now grew at impossible angles, their trunks twisting in patterns that violated the basic laws of biology and physics. The sky, or what should have been the sky, now appeared as a solid wall of darkness to my right rather than above. Gravity seemed to pull from multiple directions at once. Nausea swept over me in waves. I fell to my knees, fingers digging into soil that felt both familiar and subtly wrong, like fabric woven from threads that were almost, but not quite, cotton. My headlamp flickered, its beam weakening as if the light itself struggled to exist in this place. When I managed to look up, I froze. Through the distorted trees ahead, I could see lights, warm yellow lights that I recognized immediately. The cabin, my cabin. But viewed from an angle that should have been impossible. I was looking at its eastern wall, the very side where the footprints always appeared. But I was seeing it from a perspective that couldn't exist in the three-dimensional world I knew. The cabin appeared both near and impossibly distant, both above and beside me. I crawled forward, unable to trust my legs in this warped space. As I moved toward the cabin, the tracks continued ahead of me, leading directly to the eastern wall. But they approached from this impossible direction, this 5th or 6th or 100th angle that existed beyond normal geometry. The cold intensified until each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. My vision narrowed, darkness creeping in from the edges. With the last of my strength, I lunged forward, hand outstretched toward the cabin wall that now loomed before me. My fingers brushed against rough-hewn logs that felt exactly like those I'd touched 1,000 times before. The familiarity of that sensation anchored me momentarily, giving me something solid to cling to in this sea of spatial impossibility. That's when I heard it, a sound from inside the cabin, a soft shuffling of movement, the creak of floorboards under weight, the distinct sound of pages turning. I pressed my eye against a small gap between the logs, peering into the cabin's interior. The angle was awkward, allowing me to see only a portion of the room, the reading chair near the fire, part of the kitchen table, the edge of the bed. Everything appeared normal, exactly as I'd left it, except for the figure seated in the reading chair. It was me. I watched myself turn a page in the book I'd been reading earlier that day, watched myself shift position slightly, adjusting the blanket draped across my legs, watched myself take a sip from the mug of tea I always prepared before bed. My mind fractured. This couldn't be happening. I was outside, in this impossible space, watching myself inside. Yet the evidence of my senses was undeniable. My body began to shake uncontrollably, not from cold, but from the fundamental wrongness of what I was witnessing. As I watched, the other me tensed suddenly, head turning toward the eastern wall, toward me. He set down his book and rose, moving cautiously toward the window. I scrambled backward, overwhelmed by a sudden terror of being seen by myself. My movement made the snow crunch beneath my boots. Inside, I watched myself freeze at the sound. That's when I finally understood. The footprints that appeared from nowhere weren't made by some other entity. They were mine. My own tracks, made as I returned to the cabin each night from this impossible angle. This fold in reality that I somehow traversed without conscious awareness. I wasn't following someone else's path into the forest. I was completing a loop that I'd been walking every night since arriving. The true horror wasn't that something out there was stalking me. The horror was that I wasn't who, or what, I thought I was. I backed away from the cabin, my mind reeling with implications. Who was the real me? The one inside, convinced he was alone? Or was I the copy, the echo, the fragment that existed in this distorted angle of reality? Perhaps we were both real, both trapped in an endless loop, one version living in blissful ignorance during the day, the other doomed to wander this twisted path each night. I retreated further into the warped forest. The cold had become almost unnoticeable now, as if my body had adapted to this place, or perhaps as if I were becoming less physical, less bound by normal sensations. The trees seemed to whisper around me, their branches moving without wind. They were familiar with me now, expectant. I had a choice. I could continue forward, deeper into this impossible geometry, seeking answers that might destroy what remained of my sanity. Or I could turn back, try to find my way to the cabin, confront the other me, and what? What happens when two versions of the same person occupy the same space? Instead, I chose a third option. I would wait, watch, learn. Perhaps tomorrow night I would understand more. Perhaps tomorrow night I would discover which of us was real and which was merely an echo. For now, I settle against a tree that grows at an impossible angle and watch the cabin from this vantage point that shouldn't exist. Inside, I see myself rise from the chair, move to the window, and look out into the darkness. Our eyes almost meet across the dimensional fold. He doesn't see me, but he senses something. I watch myself step outside, gathering firewood, pretending that's the reason for venturing out. That's when he notices them. The footprints. My footprints. Appearing from nowhere, leading into the forest, never returning. I watch his face contort with the same confusion and fear I felt 9 nights ago. I watch him retreat inside, secure the door, try to rationalize what he's seen. And I know with terrible certainty that in 5 more nights, he too will follow the tracks. He too will discover this impossible angle. He too will become like me. Another iteration in an endless loop. How many of us are there now? How many versions have walked this path, discovered this truth, and then what? Where do we go when we can no longer return to the cabin? When we can no longer pretend to be the original? I don't know how long I've been here. Time moves differently along this angle, but I've started to notice other tracks besides my own. Subtle variations in size and depth, as if made by feet that are almost, but not quite, identical to mine. Other versions, other iterations, all of us trapped in this endless cycle. The cold doesn't bother me anymore. Nothing does. I've begun to wonder if this was the true purpose of my coming to Patagonia all along. Not to escape from the world, but to discover these hidden dimensions of reality, these angles that shouldn't exist, to become whatever it is I'm becoming. Tomorrow night, I'll watch him follow the tracks. I'll watch him discover what I discovered. And then perhaps I'll approach him, show him that he's not alone in this endless loop. Or perhaps I'll simply make more tracks, leading deeper into the forest, into angles we have yet to discover. Because the true horror isn't being lost. It's finding out you were never what you thought you were to begin with.